Chapter 753. Yun-Yang slowly woke up from his deep slumber. His spirit, qi, and spirit were not complete after the series of extreme torment. It was inevitable that his body would feel hollowed out, but Yun-Yang felt an indescribable sense of comfort all over his body now. With just a slight thought, he could cause the yuan qi in his body to surge and flow at will. It was as if he could control it with his fingers. With a slight movement of his body immediately floated up like a feather. It was as if he was weightless, but it was not the weightlessness of losing control. Instead, it was completely under his control. When he carefully felt the surging energy in his body, there was no longer any of the violent feeling of holding it in but not spitting it out. It was only gentle and free to do as he pleased. However, its true power was clearly no less than 100 times stronger than before. It was not fake. Every single pore on his body could breathe on their own and absorb the spirit energy of heaven and earth. With just a slight thought, the spirit energy of heaven and earth in the surroundings would be absorbed into his body and silently and naturally transform into his own true essence without any obstruction. Yun-Yang was still in disbelief that he had advanced so much after his breakthrough. He then cultivated and looked within himself to see what was going on. He saw that what was flowing in his meridians was no longer the original spiritual energy but had been converted into a unique spiritual energy that resembled purple chaos. It was endless. Even his dantian had turned purple. Even the inner walls of his meridians had an additional layer of purple membrane that was flexible and highly resistant to attacks. Yun-Yang tried to channel the spiritual energy in his dantian and realized that the speed of the spiritual qi circulation in his body was at least 10 times faster than before. This improvement is not small at all. It's like ascending to heaven in a single step and becoming a Buddha on the spot. Yun-Yang checked his cultivation base again and realized that his 9 mystical cultivation methods had all advanced to the 7th pinnacle while his mystical qi cultivation base had surpassed the 9th heaven of Tao realm. Just like Ji-Lingxi, it had reached an unknown, profound realm. The most gratifying thing was that the endless divine art had also reached the pinnacle of the 5th tier. To Yun-Yang, the improvement of his cultivation base was delightful, but there were cultivation experiences to follow. Even though he had reached an unknown level in this world, there was still a direction to go forward. However, the progress of the endless divine art was too difficult. Advancing to another level was often many times more difficult than before. This breakthrough was truly a great opportunity and extremely precious. Ayaya, Emmy was so excited that it was about to go crazy. It swayed and danced in the space, its long tendrils waving rapidly. Perhaps it was too excited that it even uprooted its roots that were deeply rooted in the ground and sprinted around. Its 5 large leaves swayed everywhere, filling the space with layers of green, a delightful sight to behold. Gigi, who had also benefited greatly from this karma, used its wings, which had just grown a thin layer of feathers, to cover its head. It dived into the soil of the space, leaving only its buttocks outside. It was obviously afraid that the overly excited Emmy boss would make a mistake and accidentally knock itself out with one of its vines. Then, extreme joy would turn to sorrow and disaster would fall from the sky. Yun-Yang suppressed his joy and focused his attention on the contents of the newly ascended 5th stage of the endless divine art. The incantation for the 5th stage of the endless divine art was already reflected in his mind, but the current situation made Yun-Yang want to laugh. He had cultivated the 5th stage to its pinnacle without even knowing the incantation. What kind of situation was this? Could it be that the endless divine art had a hidden characteristic that could be achieved in one go as long as one's foundation was sufficient? In spite of this, Yun-Yang studied the incantation in detail and comprehended it seriously. In the end, he was certain that while the natural pinnacle was real, there was still a considerable difference between it and the true pinnacle of the 5th stage that was cultivated step by step. The incantation for the 5th stage, protect the world and peace beyond, where is the murderous heart? The picturesque landscape is dyed with blood, the 5 golden lotuses should always be there. As for the more specific path of cultivation as well as the things that needed to be taken note of, and so on, they all had to be operated step by step. Otherwise, he would not be able to solidify his foundation, and there would be no hope of advancing to the 6th level. This time, the explosion of the qi of heaven and earth had forcefully imbued his body with cultivation. Although it was thick, pure, and even pure, it was still incomparable to the yuan qi that he had painstakingly cultivated and polished bit by bit. In the end, techniques were the foundation of cultivation. Even if one's cultivation had reached a certain level, it did not mean that one's realm had also increased. This was especially so for a top-notch mystical technique like the endless divine art, which did not allow for too many tricks. Of course, what Yun Yang lacked now was only a period of cultivating step by step. As long as he corrected it, it would not affect his actual combat power. Actually, Yun Yang was most interested in the benefits of the endless divine art. Saber Truth, Destiny Blade. In particular, the newly acquired form and two styles actually made him feel that some parts seemed to resonate with his previous arrangements. Or perhaps it was too much of a coincidence. Saber Truth, Destiny Blade's fifth form had two styles. The first style, Door of Life and Death, the second style, 18 Abysses of Hell. Yin and Yang karma is always in the bosom. This blade opens the door of life and death. Don't talk about how ethereal heaven is, 18 Abysses of Hell invite you. Yun Yang could not help but ponder upon seeing this incantation. Right now he was working closely with the concourse of the underworld, and there was a high possibility that both parties would continue to work together. He also had plans to tell the 10 kings of hell about the location of the haunting temple that he had discovered. However, it was at this delicate moment that he had broken through to the 5th stage by chance, and the content of the incantation was like this. Although this description could be a concrete representation of the saber's power, could there really be such a coincidental timing for such an incantation to appear? Could it actually be a reminder of something? Yin and Yang karma is always in the bosom. This blade opens the door of life and death. Yun Yang murmured, door of life and death open. A blade to split life and death? However, the next line, don't talk about how ethereal heaven is, 18 Abysses of Hell invite you, has another meaning that is thought-provoking. A blade to send you to hell? 18 Abysses of Hell invite me? Yun Yang felt that no matter how he explained it, there would be a certain logic to it. Perhaps his collaboration with the 10 kings of hell could be extended further. However, all of this needed more concrete evidence. Yun Yang did not slack off, attempting to execute the saber to practice the newly acquired 1 and 2 styles. The moment he tried them out, he had an inexplicable feeling that the 2 styles were out of place. It was not as smooth and natural as the previous few styles. Yun Yang was silent for a moment before he continued to practice. However, he still could not master them despite repeated attempts. The indescribable sluggishness was still present. If such a style were to be used in a battle, the only outcome would be to send himself to his death. There was no chance of survival. He stopped, no longer forcing himself to cultivate, and turned to thinking in silence. Up until now he had obtained a total of 5 styles and 10 styles of Saber Truth, Destiny Blade. Chapter 754. Yun Yang's mind raced as he began to practice from the beginning, linking all 5 styles and 10 styles together to test it out. The first 4 styles of Saber Truth, Destiny Blade could be said to be the pinnacle of mastery in this world, perfect and flawless. It was the same for this test. However, just as his saber style was about to end after passing through the mountain of white bones, it suddenly switched to the gate of life and death, as if it was out of his control. With a hum, the air swirled violently in the air, forming a whirlpool. An eerie aura spread out in all directions. Yun Yang was surrounded by specks of starlight, gleaming with saber light. The power of the 5th style had been unleashed inadvertently, but it was unknown whether it was unexpected or within reason. Yun Yang understood it immediately. Without stopping, he performed another style of the 5th style, the 18 Levels of Hell. At once, the space collapsed in response to the attack, 6 points of spatial collapse appearing simultaneously. It was as if the gates of hell had opened, the wails of ghosts and howls of deities could be heard. At that moment, it was as if countless ferocious ghosts had appeared in the air, pouncing over with bared fangs and brandished claws. Yun Yang retracted his saber abruptly, but he had already understood what was going on. I see. He finally understood that the true meaning of the 5th style did not exist on its own, but it was a variation that connected the previous style to the next. Only the activation of the previous 4 styles could create the unique state of the gate of life and death and the 18 levels of hell, triggering unprecedented lethality. It was a variation beyond a variation, a technique beyond a technique. When it came to the 6th style, there should be an even more bizarre change. Furthermore, he had just learned it, so his proficiency in the style was limited. For now, he could only produce 6 points of spatial collapse, which meant that only 6 levels of hell would appear. He would probably need to master this style to be able to summon the 18 levels of hell and truly live up to its name. Thinking of this, he could not help but recall the wails of ghosts and deities just now. Yun Yang was a little excited. If the 18 levels of hell were to open at the same time, how spectacular would that be? From now on, I'll have to train harder and harder. I can't slack off in the slightest. I'll have to squeeze myself a little more. Yun Yang thought to himself, there are too many masters in this world, and there will always be someone better than you out there. With my current cultivation base, perhaps I can be considered a top-notch character in the Tianshan continent, but if I analyze it in detail, it's still far from enough. Whether it's Ji Lingxi's insane father or the legendary 17th Master of the Abyss, the difference is still too great. It had to be said that young Master Yun's horizons had been broadened, and his goals had been raised. Previously they had only wanted to annihilate the Four Seasons Tower, but now their target had changed to the 17th young Master of the Abyss and Ji Lingxi's father. He made up his mind, stood up and opened his eyes. However, he was shocked by what he saw. As far as the eye could see, it was a sea of purple light that almost blinded Yun Yang. What is this? What's the situation now? Why is it so spectacular? Yun Yang looked at the surroundings of his room. There were purple crystals everywhere, glowing with a violet radiance. Other than the empty space beside him, the rest of the room was filled with these things. Although the tendon of each crystal wasn't big, it was only the size of a palm, but it was still as big as a palm. Yun Yang grabbed a piece and studied it in his hand. He could feel that the purple crystal contained an unusually pure spiritual qi. These are spiritual qi crystals that have materialized. Yun Yang was shocked by his own knowledge. Spiritual qi was formless and formless. Only when it had reached a certain density would it appear milky white, and only when it had reached a certain mystical state would it appear purple. When this state was 100 times denser, the spiritual qi would appear in liquid form. On this basis, when it was 100 times denser, the spiritual qi would solidify. However, what stage would it take for it to completely condense into a cube like this? Yun Yang could not understand it at all. Lifting his head to look around once more, he saw the purple cubes that had piled up like a mountain. At that moment, his mind was blank. How many spiritual qi crystals were there in this room? At the very least, a few thousand would be more than enough for the most conservative of considerations. Yun Yang was even sure that with these purple spiritual qi crystals, even if he went to some realm without any spiritual qi of heaven and earth, it would still be enough for him to take 2 big steps forward. 3 big steps? 5 big steps? Maybe even more. But who put these here? Could it be that someone actually took advantage of the time when I was practicing and entered this room? Yun Yang was baffled, cold sweat dripping from his forehead. These purple crystals weren't here when I came in. Otherwise, I wouldn't have missed them no matter how blind I was. Yun Yang was both surprised and delighted at the same time, but his shock was far greater than his joy. The rewards he had gained from this encounter were unimaginable, and the spiritual crystals before him were even more beneficial. However, when he thought of how someone had approached him silently just now without him noticing, and how no outsider had ever set foot in the residence of 9 Supremes ever since it had appeared, could someone really sneak in? If it was true, then wouldn't his divine ability have already arrived at a shocking level? No matter what he wanted to do to him, he could only wait for death and be at the mercy of his opponent, just like a fish on an anvil. When he thought up to here, how could he not be shocked, terrified, and inconsolable? Filled with doubts, Yun Yang walked out of the room, still shaken. He really wanted to ask, who is it? Who is it? After all, it was a matter of life and death. The earlier he figured it out, the earlier he could die, the earlier he could be reborn. But before he could say these words in his heart, he was stunned by what he saw in front of him. The hall and the courtyard of the residence of 9 Supremes were filled with these purple spiritual crystals. They were densely packed and piled high. With just a glance, Yun Yang had already come up with a terrifying number. There were at least 1 million of them. Ha! Yun Yang's mouth was agape, unable to utter a word for a long time. He could even feel that his eyeballs were about to pop out of their frames and fall to the ground. This was a huge amount of wealth. The so-called great wealth was nothing more than this, right? It was enough to surpass everyone's knowledge in this world. Yun Yang was certain that even if all the cultivation resources in the entire Tianshan continent were to be gathered together and all the spiritual qi in this world for hundreds and thousands of years were to be collected, there was an 80 to 90% chance that there would be so many pure spiritual qi crystals. However, they were everywhere in the residence of 9 Supremes now. Even the inside of the courtyard walls were filled with these crystals. The entire residence of 9 Supremes had completely turned into a magnificent palace built entirely of purple spiritual qi crystals. Moreover, this was not all. Chapter 755. Yun Yang turned his head around in a daze. As he scanned his surroundings, he was shaken once more. Other than Supreme Earth's room, the other 8 rooms had all opened their doors. Each room was occupied by the purple spiritual crystals, filling them to the brim. Poof! Yun Yang was so shocked that he lost his balance and fell to the ground. It was the famous state of hitting a rock with an egg. A certain someone had been forcefully instilled with heaven and earth's spiritual energy, had been cleansed both internally and externally, and his physical body had been tormented many times. His clothes were long gone and he was completely naked now. Falling to the ground was, of course, like hitting a rock with an egg. Could this be the real secret of the residence of 9 Supremes? Yun-Yang, who was still stuck in the state of hitting a rock with an egg, blanked out. He stared at the purple spiritual chi crystals in a daze, his scalp tingling. I believe that with these resources in front of me, it should be more than enough to make a lord of the starry sky. If it's only the so-called immortal of Earth, why would such a massive amount of resources be needed? Yun-Yang murmured, twisting his thigh forcefully. However, no matter how hard he tried, he could not feel the pain. After this huge accident, he was astonishingly unable to feel pain anymore. Oh my God! Yun-Yang panted heavily. He had thought that his cultivation base had skyrocketed so much in one go, and it was a joyous occasion. Now he knew that the greatest surprise was yet to come. However, when the surprise was too great and exceeded the knowledge of the person involved, it was also a burden. Just like now, the massive amount of resources had far exceeded the limits of Yun-Yang's knowledge. It was true that the entire Tianshan continent could not even gather a 10th or 20% of the resources before him, but it was far from enough to make a lord of the starry sky with just these. It was only the conceit of a frog at the bottom of a well. On the other hand, before a frog at the bottom of a well leaped out of the well, the sky he saw was only so vast. It was the same for Yun-Yang now. Although he was experienced, knowledgeable, and had many fortuitous encounters, he could not help but be shocked when he saw the purple spiritual chi crystals before him. As far as his current knowledge was concerned, he really couldn't understand what kind of resources, what kind of person, and what kind of magical power was needed to gather so many spiritual chi crystals at once. He didn't even know what they were called, but he had never seen anything so precious in his life. As a result, he was completely stunned. There seemed to be a purple light flickering in the corner of his eyes. It was so dazzling that it hurt. Yun-Yang turned around abruptly and looked over. Where the 9 heavens dictum had been, there was now a purple jade flute lying there quietly, glowing brilliantly. Purple jade flute? Yun-Yang found it vaguely familiar. Was this not Heaven's Inquisition, the flute that Gu Chaoyang often played with? But why would this flute appear here? Yun-Yang walked closer slowly and extended his hand to take the flute down gently. Fiddling with it, it felt warm to the touch and he could not bear to let it go. After a while, an indescribable sense of familiarity rose within him. At that moment, the platform where the 9 heavens dictum had been placed emitted a blurry glow. Then, a graceful red silhouette flew out in a light and graceful manner. The blurry silhouette stood dozens of feet away from him. The red silhouette's silhouette was blurry, her face indistinct and her body lithe as she stood in the air. No matter how hard he looked, he could not see the face clearly. He could not even get a clear view of the person's physique. However, the elegance, the posture, the aura. Yun-Yang understood it without any doubt. There was only one thought in Yun-Yang's mind. The person before him was definitely the most beautiful woman he had ever seen in his life. Since the beginning of time, she was unparalleled. She was a beauty that could not be found anywhere else in the world. Just one glance was enough to confirm it. There would not be a second person like her, despite the boundless mystical chi of creation in the vast universe. She only stood there quietly, but she gave off the feeling that she was a fairy dancing in the 9 heavens. It was as if the entire world was swirling and dancing with her dance. However, she did not move. This was the first feeling that rose from the bottom of Yun-Yang's heart. It was as if the silhouette before him was filled with a sense of familiarity, a genuine desire to be close and adore. It was an inexplicable sense of joy and contentment. On the hazy face of the red-clothed figure, a pair of eyes seemed to be quietly observing him. Suddenly she opened her mouth and spoke in an elegant and ethereal voice, "Child, these are all gifts from your aunt. Do you like them?" "Aunt?" Yun-Yang cried out involuntarily, his heart thumping wildly and his mouth parched. You're my aunt?" The words that came out of his mouth were just an instinctive reaction. Right now his mind was in a mess. Since when did I have an aunt? The person before me is my aunt? Where did this come from? He had only considered this point. He had not considered the so-called gifts at all. The red silhouette sighed softly and said, "Poor child, you've suffered a lot along the way." It was a simple sentence, but Yun-Yang suddenly had the urge to cry aloud. He was like a child who had been wronged and had suddenly seen his family, someone he could rely on. He could vent the negative emotions in his heart to his heart's content. As soon as he thought of this, his eyes turned red. The red silhouette spoke in an indignant tone, "Your aunt has never liked disobedient and unfilial children. However, if you see your father in the future and want to beat him up to vent your anger, your aunt can make an exception and show my support. There has never been such cruel parents in this world. This is too much. Your aunt's gifts to you are far more than these, but your father thinks that this little bit of support is too much. It's unreasonable, insane, and infuriating." The red silhouette said gently, "Child, your aunt will make it up to you in the future. We have plenty of time in the future. Far more than that. This little bit." Even though Yunyang was mentally prepared, he was still taken aback by the two terms. "You call this a little bit?" The red lady looked at Yunyang with a gentle gaze and said, "Child, do you have anything to say?" Hearing this, Yunyang was stunned. His heart was filled with a myriad of emotions. Yunyang's eyes were red as he asked in a choked voice, "Aunt, who am I? Who are my parents? My father is alive and well, but what about my mother? Who is she?" He didn't know why, but he subconsciously believed the red-clothed woman's words without a doubt. "This is my aunt, there's no doubt about it." Chapter 756. The red silhouette hesitated, obviously troubled by Yunyang's question. Finally, she sighed and said, "Child, your questions will be answered in the future. Right now, it's the most important and crucial moment of your life. You have to rely on yourself in the future. Your aunt can't help you any more than that. Even for me to come down this time, I had to join forces with many brothers to beat up your father." Yunyang nodded, feeling much more at ease. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of security as if he had roots. "Your father is used to being unreasonable, selfish, cruel, and dictatorial. In short, he's not a good person. I've quarreled with him for so many years because of you." The figure in red seemed to be gnashing her teeth in anger. "Don't worry about your mother either. The two of them were living a carefree and happy life together, but they left their son to suffer. What they did really made Auntie's heart explode with anger. You must avenge Auntie in the future. When the time comes, don't be too harsh. After all, he's your biological father." Yunyang felt the rock in his heart melt away bit by bit at this moment, his heart filled with joy. He nodded and said with a smile, "Aunt, if there's such a day in the future, I'll definitely avenge you. I'll definitely hit the target. I'll be filial to you and remember your kindness for the rest of my life." The red silhouette said contentedly, "Good child, truly Auntie's good child. Your words have touched Auntie's heart. I won't say any more. The time that Auntie can appear in this world is limited. I'm leaving now. In this world, you can only rely on your own strength to fight. I've come this time because I've fought with your father. I may not be able to come again. These men's hearts are all made of steel. My heart is as hard as steel, it's never just a saying." Sigh. She sighed softly and looked at Yunyang longingly, saying, "Child, do you have anything to say? Do you have any private words that you want me to bring to your parents?" Yunyang was silent for a moment before he said dryly, I don't know anything now. I have nothing to say. I really have nothing to say." The red-clothed woman's heart suddenly ached. She gently said, "You will know everything in the future. You only need to remember one thing. Before you know these things, you can only rely on yourself in this world. Do you understand?" Yunyang smiled faintly and said, "I've never relied on anyone. Yes, your father is a ruthless person. He doesn't even recognize his own family. He's not a good person. In this world you must protect yourself well. If anything happens, it will be real. Do you understand?" The red-robed woman was obviously worried, and she repeatedly reminded him again and again. "I understand." Yunyang nodded. If there was an accident, then it would be true. It seemed that this father of his was not an ordinary kind of ruthless person. Listening to his aunt's repeated reminders, Yunyang finally came to a realization. It seemed that if he were to die in this world, there would at most be someone who could avenge him. As for coming back to life, that was probably impossible. Do I care? The red-clothed woman's silhouette was slowly fading. She seemed to be very dissatisfied with her current state as she muttered a curse. What a cruel thing. His heart has become vicious after finding a wife. Where did the heart he had back then go? He's forgotten about it after marrying a wife. Then she suddenly said hurriedly, "Child, take care. I'm really leaving." Just as the red silhouette disappeared, a finger was suddenly extended and pointed from afar. Yunyang felt as if his forehead had been touched as an inexplicable message flowed into his mind bit by bit. Then he felt warm all over, even his heart. Then he closed his eyes and laid down slowly on the ground, falling asleep. The red silhouette disappeared silently. Only a sentence was left in the air, I'll go back and settle the score with them right now. As long as you don't go up, I'll fight them both. No matter how clever you are, can you have more helpers than me? Do you really think I can't bear to hit you? I'll hit your wife too this time. She murmured to herself, counting with her fingers, 6th, 7th, and the others probably won't dare, but there's still 2nd brother, 4th brother, 5th brother, big sister Z and the rest. It's enough to beat them up. If it really doesn't work, I'll let junior brother Tan go talk to him. Child, with this skill to protect yourself, unless it's an enemy whose cultivation base is 100 times stronger than yours. However, Yunyang had already fallen asleep, so he did not hear the conversation. After a long time, Yunyang slowly woke up. He sat on the ground in a daze, looking at the purple jade flute in his hand and then at the stage where the 9 heavens dictum had been. For a moment, a feeling that felt surreal lingered in his heart, lingering for a long time. Just now, could it be a dream? A dream that he had finally tasted, a dream that he had yearned for day and night. But why was it so real? Perhaps it was not a dream. Not only did he have parents, but he also had an aunt? His biological aunt? Then, was he not an orphan? There was a reason for everything that had happened all along the way. All of this still felt like a beautiful dream. Is this real or not? Yun Yang's anxiety grew and spread, strongly suspecting that he had only been in a dream born of his obsession. He sprung up without warning and sprinted all the way out. Looking at the mountain of purple spiritual crystals, he sprinted to each room, repeatedly confirming the authenticity of the crystals. Then he sprinted back, looking at the purple jade flute in his hand and the place where the lady in red had popped out from earlier, that everything that had happened was real. It was real. Yun Yang stood there in a daze, tears streaming down his cheeks. It's all true, it's all true, it's all true, ha. Tears streamed down his face as he suddenly burst into laughter. He felt that his mind was warm, and the loneliness in the depths of his heart had disappeared without a trace at this moment. As for the fact that no one was there to care for him and he could only rely on himself, was this even a problem? When have I, Yun Yang, ever relied on others? Even if you want to care for me, I won't let you. I'll definitely become the world's unrivaled expert in the future. I'll show you. I'll hit you every day. That won't do, I can't hit you. Even if I don't hit you, I'll scare you every day. Well, scaring you doesn't seem to work either. What should I do? Lord Supreme Cloud was being arrogant. As the last bit of haze in his heart dissipated, he was surprised to find a sword style appearing in his mind. This sword technique could be said to be unusually clear, as if it was branded in his soul and could not be erased. It had just appeared in his mind, but as he thought about it, everything was natural and familiar, as if he had practiced this style for centuries. Other than the sense of familiarity, Yun Yang also came to a conclusion. This style was incredibly powerful. Chapter 757. To Yun Yang, coming to this conclusion was extremely absurd. In Yun Yang's cognitive imagination, saber truth, Destiny Blade was already a flawless and perfect technique. There was no other technique that could surpass it. However, the appearance of this sword technique had shattered Yun Yang's inherent understanding. What harm is there in slaughtering the entire world? Yun Yang could not help but be speechless as he recited the technique's name. Everything else aside, the menacing aura emanating from the technique's name was already too strong. It was appallingly brutal. What harm was there in slaughtering the entire world? It was simply, the intensity of the murderous nature was inconceivable. Although this technique is unparalleled and unrivaled, advancing with an indomitable will, even if the entire world is in front of me, I can only use a sword technique. The only weapon that truly suits me is the saber. Yun Yang pondered, this technique should be a gift from my aunt to me because of that finger. It's a marvelous self-defense technique, truly remarkable. Especially if I'm trapped and can use this technique to break out, it's the best. It looks like I'll have to find a sword for myself. I can use the divine edge to transform it when the time comes. He exhaled deeply as if he had exhaled all the worries and self-pity in his heart. His state of mind was broadened at once. The sky was high, the earth was high, and the clouds were boundless. How comfortable. How soothing. Yun Yang laughed with his head held high. Holding the purple jade flute in his hand, he stood up and walked out. The breeze was cool and refreshing. Yun Yang felt refreshed all over, his thighs feeling even smoother. He lowered his head subconsciously, but his face and ears were flushed instantly. It was probably because he was too shocked before that everything that had happened was unimaginable. It was hard to imagine that only now did a certain someone realize that he was actually in a meticulously clean state. When his aunt came earlier, He had been sitting on the ground, delirious and wearing clothes. Now that he stood up, his clothes had slipped off and he was truly clean. Luckily he had only just begun to take big strides. If he were to walk out of the residence of 9 Supremes in this state, he would be too ashamed to continue living. Hurry up and put on your clothes. In an instant he was dressed in his usual purple robe. A certain someone had once again returned to being an elegant and beautiful young man. Since this boundless wealth is a gift from Auntie, then I don't have to worry about its origin. Now that my cultivation is improving, what I need to do is to strengthen my current foundation. If I continue to blindly pursue progress, it will be more haste than speed. So I'll leave these spiritual origin crystals here first. I'll come and get it when I need it. It was not wrong for Yun Yang to think so. He was the only person in the world who could enter the residence of 9 Supremes now. This was tantamount to his personal treasure trove. It was absolutely safe. Having made up his mind, he put away Supreme Earth's will solemnly and walked out in a carefree manner. However, just as he soared into the sky and turned into a white cloud, with a loud bang, the purple mist instantly filled the sky, instantly covering the surrounding area for several miles. Everyone in the vicinity was blinded, unable to see a thing. Even Ling Xiaozue and the others who had been paying attention to the residence of 9 Supremes could not help but be blinded by the sudden turn of events. The commotion came too abruptly, causing gasps to ring out one after another in an endless stream. With another loud bang, the entire Tiantang city seemed to tremble because of it. Yun Yang, who was directly involved, was shocked to see the residence of 9 Supremes below him sway and fly up. The humongous residence of 9 Supremes had really flown up. Then, the residence of 9 Supremes shrunk visibly and finally turned into a ray of purple light, catching up to him and vanishing. Yun Yang's thoughts spun rapidly as he searched his body. Finally, he found a purple jade pendant the size of a thumb on the purple jade flute. The pavilions and terraces carved on the jade pendant were lifelike, resembling the residence of 9 Supremes. Yun Yang was shaken once more, almost falling from the sky. Was the residence of 9 Supremes just a pendant of this purple jade flute? What was the origin of this purple jade flute then? Why had it fallen into Heaven's Inquisition's hands previously and why had it appeared in the residence of 9 Supremes now? Furthermore, he was obviously the true owner of this jade flute, but if Heaven's Inquisition were to quarrel with him, what should he say and what should he do? This was a huge problem. Not only did everything happen abruptly, the course of events was inconceivable and unexpected. Yun Yang felt like he had fallen into a cloud of fog, unable to make sense of it. However, Yun Yang was not dissatisfied with the fact that the residence of 9 Supremes could be carried with him at all times in this manner. It was much cheaper for him. Ling Xiaozue and the others had been observing from the outside, wanting to see what was so special about the residence of 9 Supremes. Although they knew their limits, it was good to widen their horizons with such a magical object in this world. However, they did not expect the residence of 9 Supremes to suddenly explode with a blinding light, blinding everyone who had their eyes wide open. For a moment they could not see anything. Just when everyone was panicking and unable to control themselves, they felt their vision slowly clearing up, and slowly they could see something again. When everyone looked again, they were all shocked and turned pale with fright. Where was the residence of 9 Supremes? The residence of 9 Supremes that had become a legend of this world, a forbidden land of Yutong, had vanished into thin air. Both of them could only feel a buzz in their heads. Dugu Chao's reaction was slightly more normal. After all, he had not thought too much about it, but Ling Xiaozue felt differently. During this period of time, Ling Xiaozue had learned from various channels and aspects that his young brother, Yun Yang, was most likely Yutong's guardian, supreme cloud of the 9 Supremes. Now that the massive residence of 9 Supremes had disappeared, what about Yun Yang? What about Yun Yang himself? Ling Xiaozue was anxious, especially when he recalled that he was the culprit behind the disappearance of the residence of 9 Supremes. If he had not tossed the purple jade flute, he leaped into the air and looked as far as his eyes could see, spreading his deific consciousness to check the surroundings. He prayed silently in his heart, "Please don't let anything happen to you. Please don't let anything happen to you." It was not only Ling Xiaozue. His Majesty and the others had seen the residence of 9 Supremes vanish into thin air from afar. His Majesty's eyes were wide open and he almost fainted. Qiu Jinhan's eyes were blank as well, his face pale and his body wobbling. For a moment, he could only taste the sweetness in his throat and almost spit out a mouthful of blood. The residence of 9 Supremes, the 9 Supremes, had been the symbol of the Empire of Yutong for so many years, almost the spiritual pillar. The situation was great now, but who would have thought that it would vanish so inexplicably today? Could it be that the prophecy had come true? Had His Majesty's repeated rumblings about the external forces really come true and the residence of 9 Supremes was gone? This was to destroy Yutong's foundation. Such a heavy blow could not be endured by ordinary citizens, let alone Yutong's high-ranking officials. Was Yutong's guardian no longer around? However, at this moment, the sky that had already returned to being clear and sunny suddenly surged with wind and clouds again. A white cloud, appearing out of nowhere, suddenly displayed a strange change in the sky. Almost in the blink of an eye, the white cloud turned into a cloud-shaped giant that connected heaven and earth. Chapter 758. From a rough estimation, the giant was at least thousands of feet tall. Everyone felt that once the giant opened his eyes, there would be 2 more suns in the sky, intimidating and intimidating. "I am Supreme Cloud. I am well, safe and sound." The giant's voice was like spring thunder, rumbling across the land. The residence of 9 Supremes is a divine artifact of heaven and earth. The original purpose of its emergence is to stabilize Yutong's providence. It can't stay in the mortal realm for long. Now that Yutong's mystical chi has been established and the nation's destiny is stable, there's no need for the residence of 9 Supremes to rely on. Therefore, this Supreme has taken the residence of 9 Supremes away today. To prevent any mischief, this is my farewell. I only wish for the Empire of Yutong to pacify Tianxian, for 1,000 years of peace and prosperity for the nation and its people. His words reverberated throughout the city. Once he was spoken, the entire city could hear him clearly. In fact, everyone within a radius of several thousand miles could hear it clearly. It was so loud that it could be heard from afar. All of Yutong's citizens were shaken, but they were immediately relieved. Everyone had the same thought: yes, a divine artifact like the residence of 9 Supremes shouldn't stay in the mortal realm for long. Lord Supreme Cloud is right to take it away. As for why Lord Supreme Cloud could take it away, was this not a question? How could a godly figure like Lord Supreme Cloud not take the residence of 9 Supremes? The residence of 9 Supremes belonged to Supreme Cloud, so there was no objection to him taking it away. It would be strange if there was someone else in this world who could take the residence of 9 Supremes away. A storm that could shake the nation had vanished into thin air with just a few words from Yunyang. Even His Majesty the Emperor of Yutong could never achieve such influence. Listening to his words, looking at the giant in the sky, looking at the faces of the officials around him, and looking at the cheers and joy of the people around them, His Majesty the Emperor sighed softly. Suddenly, the desire to seek out Supreme Cloud and use him vanished without a trace. Enslaving Supreme Cloud? Under such circumstances and with such influence, it would be as easy as flipping a palm for Supreme Cloud to replace him. Wanting to control such a character with the schemes of a monarch was nothing more than a pipe dream. From now on, Supreme Cloud. His Majesty seemed to have untangled a knot in his heart as he said softly, "Do whatever you want, as long as it doesn't harm the Empire." Sigh. "Your Majesty is wise." Qiu Jianhan and Fang Qingtian bowed at the same time, expressing their support for His Majesty with their actions. His Majesty laughed out loud, shook his head and said with a sigh, "It's me. Things have been going too smoothly for me recently. Once I had a thought, anger arose in my heart and wild thoughts arose. It's not too late to wake up today." Qiu Jianhan and Fang Qingtian looked at each other and smiled, feeling as if a huge burden had been lifted from their hearts. All this while, both of them had been suppressing their worries about the conflict between the 9 Supremes and the imperial power. His Majesty the Emperor was wise and resolute in his killing. He was undoubtedly a heroic ruler of his generation and was in the prime of his life. In spite of this, the 9 Supremes were like gods in Yutong. This was almost a battle between the imperial power and the divine power. Yet, this god was a living, breathing existence and his abilities were truly remarkable. Once a fight broke out, no matter which side emerged victorious, it would be a catastrophe for the Empire of Yutong. The nation would no longer be a nation. Fortunately, this worry was finally gone now. The residence of 9 Supremes has disappeared, and Supreme Cloud has vanished from the world as well. It's wishful thinking to want to find him again. His Majesty sighed. He stared at the spot where the residence of 9 Supremes used to be, feeling a stabbing pain in his heart. The residence of 9 Supremes was still there. Whenever he saw it, it was as if his eldest son was still by his side. But now, the residence of 9 Supremes was gone. His Majesty felt an empty space in his heart, an unbearable emptiness. His straight back had inexplicably hunched. "Let's go back to the palace?" He stood in a daze for a long time before he finally said with a sigh, "Old Qiu, accompany me to the residence of King Yun." His Majesty said weakly, "I wish to see Bao'er. I haven't seen him for a long time." "All right." Qiu Jianhan agreed immediately. Supreme Cloud's words traveled leisurely. Some of them were shaken to the core when they heard it. When the 9 Supremes are formed, the world is secure, 1,000 years of prosperity, the foundation of all ages. These words had been circulating in the Tianshan continent for a long time. Now that Supreme Cloud, the only remaining member of the 9 Supremes, had said something like this, what did it mean? Everyone was deep in thought. Listening to Supreme Cloud's parting words, Ling Xiaozue and the others were relieved as well and were about to leave. Dugucho sighed, "I used to think that Yutong's 9 Supremes were nothing but a product of Yutong's people's false rumors, that they were, at most, frauds that deceived the gods and ghosts. Now that I've seen Supreme Cloud today, I realize that the rumors were one-sided. He's really like a god. It's a pity that I can't meet such a hero." Ling Xiaozue was still lost in thought as he said, "Yes, yes." A clear voice beside him said with a smile, "Senior Ling, what do you mean by yes? It's rare to hear you say something like this. Would you be willing to share?" Both of them turned to look at the person who spoke. Ling Xiaozue's eyes shone as he smiled sincerely and said, "It's you, child." The person who stood not far away from him was dressed in purple, his features as handsome as jade. He was so handsome that he did not seem to belong to the mundane world. He was walking towards the two of them with a smile like an immortal. Who else could it be if not Yin Yang? Dugucho could hear Ling Xiaozue exhale clearly. It was a sigh of relief. However, how could this child before him be worthy of Ling Xiaozue's attention? "Are you all right?" Ling Xiaozue asked with a smile as he looked at Yin Yang, his gaze scrutinizing. Yin Yang chuckled. "Do I look like I'm in trouble looking like this?" I'm fine now." Ling Xiaozue chuckled. "It's good that you're fine. Let's go back. We'll talk about it when we get back." Ling Xiaozue returned to his usual self as he chuckled. It was as if nothing mattered to him, as if he did not see anything. Everything in the world seemed so normal to him, but it was a pity that Dugucho was not having it. He saw the purple jade flute in Yun Yang's hand and his eyes widened. That was the purple jade flute in Gu Chaoyang's hand. The purple jade flute that he had knelt to beg Ling Xiaozue to send to the residence of 9 Supremes that day? This purple jade flute had brought Gu Chaoyang's legacy and entrustment. But now, it was in Yun Yang's hands. What did this mean? What did it mean? At that moment, Dugu Chao's thoughts were in disarray. He was not feeling well. His mind was in a whirlwind. Did this mean that, as long as I follow this child Yun, I can see my wife? Did this mean that Yun Yang was the person that Gu Chaoyang had hinted at? Chapter 759. Until they returned, Dugu Cho, a pinnacle expert who had been unrivaled in this world for centuries, was still in a daze. The three of them had traveled much faster than the rest. In addition, the three of them were preoccupied with their own thoughts and did not speak along the way. Yun Yang was counting his gains, reveling in them as he did so. His heart and mouth were beaming with joy, his face glowing as he walked. Ling Xiaozue was also combing through his gains. His improvement this time was significant, equivalent to at least half of a 60-year cycle of cultivation. However, his cultivation base was already at the pinnacle of this world. What could he do to push his cultivation base and combat power to the next level? This was a problem that needed to be solved urgently. Dugucho, on the other hand, was burdened with worries. What should he do after this? How could he hope to fulfill his long-cherished wish? At the entrance of the residence of Yun, Jilingxi was standing there, watching with her head raised. Anxiety and worry were written all over her pretty face. Beside her was Shangguan Lingxiu, who looked equally worried. Both of them wanted to go to the residence of 9 Supremes to see what was going on, but Yun Xiaoyao would not allow it. Yun Yang alone is already worrying enough. If the two of you were to go over as well, with so many experts and almost all the pinnacle experts gathered at this critical juncture, just the safety issue alone would scare the wits out of us if the two of you were to go over. No going. With Yun Yang's father Yun Xiaoyao's strong objection, the two girls who knew that the situation was against them, could only wait by the door obediently. Lao Mei and Fang Mafei, on the other hand, were much calmer than the rest. They even scoffed at Yun Xiaoyao and the others' anxiousness. Danger? That was impossible. That was Lord Supreme Cloud we were talking about. What danger could Supreme Cloud possibly face? This must be another fortuitous encounter. When he was still so weak, he was already invincible and had limitless opportunities. Now that his cultivation base had risen to the pinnacle of this world, what danger could there be? However, it was a pity that we had to watch over the house. If we could join in the fun, we might even be able to get a share of the loot. After all, they had experienced this kind of opportunity many times. They weren't surprised at all. Instead, they were happy to see it happen. It was only because of old Yun's father's forceful restraint that they could not act rashly. They could not help but grumble inwardly about old Yun's overreaction. It had deprived them of a chance to improve. As for the four noble young masters of Dong Tianling, they were even less worried. They did not even understand what was going on and were playing mahjong leisurely. The faces of the four of them were covered with paper slips. These paper slips were not IOU slips, but 10,000 taels of silver per slip. This method was both interesting and exciting. It could even be said that the four of them were fighting in full swing without any distractions. To put it bluntly, they were so engrossed in the fight that they wanted to completely overwhelm the others that they did not notice the change of the purple qi. Bai Yixue and his master, Xiao Xiaoqing, had already moved into the residence of Yun and were naturally waiting at the entrance. Bai Yixue looked indifferent, his emotions similar to Lao Mei and Fang Mafei, completely nonchalant. However, Xiao Xiaoqing was nervous, looking down to check his attire and tidying himself up from time to time. Then he paced around with a frown, his expression conflicted and expectant. It was obvious that he was worried about his gains and losses. Occasionally, clouds of gray fog rose into the air around the residence of Yun. It was the 10 kings of the concourse of the underworld coming out to check. Seeing that there was no concrete news, they returned immediately. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, 3 tall silhouettes appeared at the end of the long street, walking side by side. Ji Lingxi and Shengguan Lingxiu looked from afar and heaved a sigh of relief at the same time. The person in the middle was tall, his demeanor was elegant and composed, and he was dressed in a purple robe. Who else could it be but Yin Yang? Ji Lingxi snorted, forcefully suppressing the glint of joy in her eyes. She lifted her head proudly and went back just like that. Shengguan Lingxiu could not help but take 3 to 4 steps forward to welcome him. However, when she turned to see that Ji Lingxi had already gone back, she hesitated for a moment before turning around and going back as well. Yun Yang was initially filled with excitement when he saw the 2 ladies who were deeply in love with him from afar. Just as he was about to go over and greet them, he realized that there was no longer anyone in front of him when he took 4 to 5 steps forward. Yun Yang? Ha ha. Ling Xiaozue could not help bursting into laughter. Yun Xiaoyao, who was also standing by the door with his arms behind his back, said, "Is everything all right? You're back?" His voice was calm as if he was unaffected. "Yes, everything is all right. I'm back," Yun Yang replied with a face full of reverence. That's good, Yun Xiaoyao smiled. He then nodded at Dugucho and Ling Xiaozue before turning to leave without another word. Yun Yang could see that Yun Xiaoyao was completely relaxed at the moment. He walked in without turning his head back as if he did not care whether Yun Yang returned or not. However, the trail of sweat on his back had already exposed his worry. There was only genuine shock in Yun Yang's eyes and he remained silent for a long time. "Master." With a cry of sorrow and joy, Xiao Xiaoqing knelt down with a plop and crawled forward frantically. He lifted his head, his face wet with tears. "Master." Sob sob sob. "I finally get to see you again today." Xiao Xiaoqing knelt on the ground and hugged Dugucho's leg, bawling his eyes out. He refused to get up no matter what. Dugucho sucked in a deep breath and tried his best to control his emotions, scolding him angrily, get up quickly. So many people are watching. How improper." "Master, if you don't forgive me I won't get up," Xiao Xiaoqing bawled. Dugucho retorted angrily, "Do you have any shame? You may be shameless, but do I? If I didn't forgive you, why would I ask you to come back? Could it be that I haven't been angry enough? Then is Master willing to accept me as a disciple again?" Xiao Xiaoqing lifted his head in anticipation. Dugucho snorted and said, "If not, how could I allow you to call me Master?" Xiao Xiaoqing was overjoyed. He sprung up and said with a grin, "I knew it. This disciple is so handsome and talented. How could Master bear to chase me out? Ha ha." His face was still wet with tears, it was a ghastly sight to behold, but he was actually beaming with joy. Ha! Yun Yang and Ling Xiaozue could not help guffawing. Dugucho could not help sighing, his face contorted as he said, "Xiao Xiaoqing, taking you in as a disciple might be the biggest mistake I've made in my life. I didn't expect that I, Dugucho, would make the same mistake again and again." He sighed after that. Forget it. My face has long been disgraced by you, Xiao Shaoqing stepped forward eagerly, grinning as he helped Dugucho up. He chuckled and said, "Master, if you don't embarrass your disciple, who should you embarrass? Besides, don't people live their whole lives for this face? Isn't the existence of this face? Isn't it meant to be lost? Went fishing today, wasted a day. I regret it immensely. It would have been fine if I had caught it, but it's a pity that the Air Force commander is dead." Chapter 760. Yun Yang and Ling Xiaozue were dumbfounded by the words. A man had earned his reputation all his life just to prepare to be humiliated? Such an argument was bizarre, but one had to admit that there was a tiny bit of truth to it. A twisted argument was still a reasonable one. Duguchao's face turned green in the face of such a wonderful person. He sighed at the sky, speechless. He felt that it was the biggest mistake of his life to allow this fellow back into the school. It was unforgivable. Sure enough, he had lost all his face the moment they met. "Slow down, master. Master, this disciple has specially brought your favorite Yinshan Maojian this time. This is... Master, you haven't changed at all these years. You're still as handsome and spirited as ever." Amidst Xiao Shaoqing's incessant flattery, he helped Dugucho to walk into the residence of Yun. Bai Yishua followed behind, covering his face with both hands. "What can I do? I'm also very helpless to have such a master." Dugucho sighed continuously. He had not even taken 10 steps, but he had already sighed 20 times. He deeply felt that summoning this fellow back this time could very well be the biggest mistake he had ever made in his life. He was really despicable. It wasn't easy for him to expel this scoundrel from the sect and leave the peace and quiet in front of him for so many years. But in his old age he was muddle-headed and brought him back. Looking at this despicable face made him want to violently slap it. "Xiao Shui, Xiao Shui." Xiao Shaoqing called out to his disciple as he served his master. Bai Yishua ran over with his head lowered, covering his face. "Master, I'm here. Today is a joyous day for you and me. Both of us have been taken in by your grandmaster again. This is a joyous occasion. How can we not celebrate such a joyous occasion? Go prepare 40 to 50 dishes quickly. Make it as grand as possible. Get some fine wine as well. Tonight I want to have a good time." Dugucho glared at him. "What do you want to have a good time for?" Xiao Shaoqing choked. Then he blinked his eyes and smiled. Disciple wants to smell the wine?" Dugucho heaved a long sigh into the sky. For a moment, a sense of hopelessness rose within him and lingered for a long time. The joy and excitement of seeing this disciple that he had not seen for many years actually lasted for less than a breath, and then it turned into the familiar helplessness of the past. What a sin! Anyone could see Duguchao's exasperation clearly. "Ha ha ha." Xiao Shaoqing chuckled and followed behind Dugucho like a lackey. His fists massaged his master's shoulders carefully as he turned to glare at Bai Yishua sternly, urging him to hurry up. "I'll go right away. Bai Yishua ran off, crestfallen. Master, this disciple has missed you so much all these years?" As Xiao Shaoqing spoke, the rims of his eyes reddened. "If I don't get drunk when I see you tonight, this disciple really doesn't know how else to express my excitement right now." Sob. Dugucho glared at him helplessly, feeling too weak to even sigh. "Can't you think of anything else other than wine? You're trying so hard to rejoin the school just to lift the ban on your drinking? Brother Dugu, this disciple of yours has a pure heart." That's great. Ling Xiaozue was holding back his laughter until his stomach hurt. If he did not take advantage of the situation to add fuel to the fire and stir up trouble, when would he do so? "Who are you, young one? Is there a place for you to speak here?" Xiao Shaoqing rolled his eyes and looked at Ling Xiaozue in dissatisfaction. "How dare you call my master brother? Do you know who my master is? Do you know who I am? Do you know who my disciple is?" Dugucho slapped the back of Xiao Shaoqing's head forcefully, causing the fellow to tumble. He said angrily, "How dare you be so rude? This is your senior Uncle Ling." "Senior Uncle Ling?" Xiao Shaoqing was dumbfounded. "Since when did I have a senior uncle? This fellow is obviously younger than me. How can he be a senior uncle?" "Open your dog eyes wide and look closely. This is your senior Uncle Ling Xiaozue." Dugucho introduced and suddenly flew into a rage, kicking him. ****, you've been hanging out with your disciple until now and you say you don't know who this is? Why are you acting dumb?" Only then did he realize that he had been fooled by this **** of a disciple. Xiao Shaoqing was pleasantly surprised as he turned to kowtow. Senior Uncle Ling, it's you who has come. This This disciple has long heard of your name as the world's unrivaled expert. It's a great honor to meet you today. This string of words was said almost without any hesitation. It was said in an extremely familiar and fluent manner. Ling Xiaozue could not help being stunned for a moment before he chuckled and said, "Brother Dugu, your disciple is really as you said. He's truly a marvel. Even though I know that his compliment is a compliment, I still feel honored and overwhelmed with emotion." Dugu Chao's face was flushed. He was embarrassed and angry. This was too shameful. Seeing how the child was still trying to get close to Ling Xiaozue and flattering him without holding back, Dugu Chao was infuriated and went to teach the boy a lesson. "It's fine if you say anything else, but how dare you say that Ling Xiaozue is the world's unrivaled expert? Then what about your master? Isn't he the world's unrivaled expert? Your master is the world's unrivaled expert who has been renowned for 500 years. You've just returned to the school and you're already deceiving your master and ancestor. Who else should I hit if not you? Your father is going to clean the house today and discipline your mouth." Following a certain someone's words and actions, Xiao Xiaoqing was flung around the yard like a rubber ball. His face was swollen and bruised and he was beyond recognition. When Dugu Chou finally stopped, Xiao Xiaoqing sat in the yard with a bruised face and heaved a long sigh of relief. He lifted his head and sighed, "It feels so good. It's been so many years since I've been beaten by my master. This long-lost feeling has returned. It's still so comfortable." He sucked in a deep breath and tried his best to hold back the smile that was bursting out of his lips. "Get out of my room." Seeing that Xiao Xiaoqing was about to follow him into the room, Dugu Chao's roar was like a thunderclap. Xiao Xiaoqing rolled and crawled out of the room in terror. "It's the school's misfortune? It's the school's misfortune indeed?" Dugu Chao's sigh sounded like it could not be washed away by the waves of the endless ocean. "Wah!" Ling Xiaozue clutched his stomach and laughed until he was out of breath. It had been so many years and this was truly the happiest day of his life. Chapter 761. Then Ling Xiaozue closed the door and turned together with Dugu Chou. 4 pairs of eyes stared unblinkingly at Yin Yang. Their gazes were strange, like a wolf eyeing a beauty. Yin Yang was shocked. "What are you all doing? What's with that look?" He quickly looked at himself. Ling Xiaozue smiled and said, "Young brother, you've improved a lot this time around. I see that even your temperament has changed a little. Your state of mind is more complete and flawless. It looks like you've come across something great. Congratulations." Dugu Chou guffawed as well, surprise flashing through his eyes. It was obvious that both of them had been suppressing this question along the way. Others might not be able to tell, but who were Ling Xiaozue and Dugu Chou? Yun Yang's cultivation base had improved like a meteoric rise. No matter how hard he tried to hide it, how could the two of them not notice it? Yun Yang smiled as well, pondering how he should speak and how he should phrase his words. "Young brother, you must have something to ask since you've followed us all the way. Is it something important?" asked Ling Xiaozue. "Yes, indeed," Yun Yang admitted honestly. Dugu Chou smiled as well. "You haven't spoken a word along the way, but your cultivation base has improved tremendously. You must have experienced some mystical encounter, but you didn't tell your confidant about it right away. It's obvious that you have something important troubling you. Or perhaps, it's related to your confidant as well?" Yin Yang was impressed. "Senior Dugu, you have a sharp eye indeed. Is it about cultivation base?" Ling Xiaozue asked with a faint smile. "Yes. The last time I came, I saw that there was something wrong with the girl's cultivation base. Firstly, it was unbelievable and secondly, it was unimaginable. Now that you've revealed it to me," Ling Xiaozue said, "ask directly about the information you want to know. If even the two of us can't answer the cultivation questions of this world, I'm afraid others won't be able to either." What he said was the truth. He wasn't being arrogant at all. Yun Yang mused and sorted out his thoughts before saying, "Actually, this junior's suspicion, it's nothing much to be said. It's just that, it's probably the specific division of cultivation realms in this world." Yun Yang paused before continuing, "For ordinary cultivators, reaching the pinnacle of the peak realm is already the pinnacle. However, this realm is only the entry level for high-level cultivators. Ascending to the pinnacle of the heaven realm, there's also the Tao realm. Initially, this junior had never touched upon or even imagined such a profound level. Now, however, due to fate, this junior has not only climbed to the pinnacle of the 9th heaven of Tao realm, I've even surpassed the pinnacle and reached the pinnacle. However, the pinnacle of Tao realm is already the limit of Tianshan continent's cultivators. There are no higher levels even in the legends. Regarding this, I've thought about my past experiences, especially the legends. Those legendary super experts obviously had cultivation far beyond this. For example, the 17th young master of the abyss and the others. They're definitely not people who can be summed up by the cultivation of the 9th level of the Tao realm. I've mentioned just now that my cultivation base has successfully broken through the 9th heaven of Tao realm and entered a new realm. However, this junior has no idea what kind of realm this is. Perhaps I should say, what's the path of cultivation ahead of me? Yun Yang said respectfully, please enlighten me, seniors. Dugucho and Ling Xiaozue could not help chuckling when they heard Yun Yang's words. Nostalgia flashed across their eyes as if they were reminiscing about their younger days. Yun Yang's current confusion was the same one they had encountered back then. Meeting Yun Yang's gaze once more, they could not help feeling envious. Back then, the same dilemma had troubled both of them for many, many years. Yun Yang, on the other hand, had just broken through, and now, he had two people who could enlighten him waiting for him. It was as if everything had been arranged and everything was going according to plan. They would be lying to themselves if they said they were not envious of this providence and fate. I'm really too lucky. Let me speak then. Ling Xiaozue looked at Dugucho. Dugucho gestured for Yun Yang to speak. Therefore Dugucho did not hesitate to speak. Wait, there's someone else who needs to listen as well? Yun Yang stopped him quickly. He dashed out like a wisp of smoke, dragging Ji Lingxi along with him. Ji Lingxi was cultivating outside and was caught off guard when Yun Yang grabbed her arm like a little chick. She had yet to snap out of it as she spat angrily, "You?" Just as she was about to teach him a lesson, she saw Ling Xiaozue and Dugucho looking at her with an odd smile. She could not help blushing, not knowing where to place her hand that had been raised. Why don't you quickly sit down and listen to the two seniors talk about cultivation levels? Haven't you always been thinking about the problem of higher cultivation levels? Yun Yang did not stand on ceremony and pointed at the chairs to assign them. Ever since he had broken through, Yun Yang felt unprecedentedly confident. He had regained his "your brother entrusted you to mean" attitude. Hearing the tone that she had not heard for a long time, Ji Lingxi's breath was stuck in her chest and could not be released. She sat down sulkily and rolled her eyes, but she perked up her ears obediently. Honestly, the issue of a higher level of cultivation was what troubled her the most now. Now that everyone was present, Ling Xiaozue began to speak. Cultivation begins with the Dantian, controlling the qi of heaven and earth, traveling through the 9 orifices and 13 meridians of the human body and assimilating it into the body. I believe all of you don't know about this foundation, but this is the foundation of all cultivators. I won't elaborate further. All cultivators in Tianshan continent come into contact with mystical qi the moment they enter the sect. The origin of mystical qi is something a sage once said, the door of Tao is a mystery beyond a mystery. Therefore, the qi of heaven and earth in this world is referred to as mystical qi. Ling Xiaozue's words unraveled a mystery in Yun Yang's heart. All cultivators think of themselves as superior, their abilities incomparable to those of ordinary people. With this as the starting point, cultivators label the cultivation methods and realms they cultivate as exceptionally superior. Who knows how many years ago they called them the peak realm, the heaven realm, and the Tao realm. As the saying goes, to cross mountains after mountains, to cross a heaven, to see another heaven, to step onto the path of Tao, to see the 9 heavens, this is how it goes. Yun Yang nodded, expressing his understanding. Ling Xiaozue's words were concise, but they had explained the cultivation path of Tianshan continent's cultivators. Ji Lingxi could not help but ponder as well, recalling her own cultivation path step by step. She murmured, I see. However, the path of cultivation is long and endless. How can there only be these 3 realms? The so-called peak of this world is only the peak of Tianshan continent's cultivators, not the peak of cultivation. Chapter 762. Ling Xiaozue's expression was solemn as he said in a low voice, perhaps it's easier for the both of you to understand because you already possess a cultivation base that surpasses the 9th level of Tao realm. Of course, you would understand that there's a higher level. However, many cultivators in Tianshan continent were troubled by this bottleneck for countless years back then. They knew that there was a path ahead, but they had no clue where to start. Yun Yang's expression was one of understanding, but he was also a little perplexed. After a pause he asked, May I ask, Senior, what is the reason behind this? Ling Xiaozue chuckled humorlessly. The bottleneck after the 9th level of Tao realm is very different from the bottleneck of the peak realm and heaven realm. When one reaches the limit of the 9th level of Tao realm, the Dantian in one's body can no longer contain mystical qi. The more one absorbs, the more one loses. Based on this premise, there's naturally no way forward. Until there was a senior, who had reached the peak of his cultivation base. He tried everything he could, but he couldn't make any progress. Feeling depressed, his enemies found out about his whereabouts. They even gathered a dozen experts of the same level to ambush him. It was an unintentional battle. The senior was first poisoned, then he was ambushed and severely injured. Then he was hunted all the way. Exhausted, he couldn't continue and his life was about to come to an end. Helpless, he was forced to perform the art of soul disintegration, wanting to perish together with the enemy. However, not only was he lacking in strength, he had suffered too many injuries. His physical body was already riddled with holes, to the point that he couldn't complete the self-detonation. However, it was at such a critical juncture that he felt that the mystical chi of heaven and earth drawn into his body by the art of soul disintegration did not leak out. Instead, it charged madly and irregularly within his body. Then he realized that 2 new chakras had been awakened from the original 9 chakras in his body. With the awakening of these 2 chakras, his ability improved tremendously and his condition recovered. He managed to turn the tables and defeat a dozen experts of the same level, forcing them to flee. Since then, it was then spread among the higher-ups that there are more than just 9 chakras in a human body. There are hidden chakras, there are many of them. Ling Xiaozui sighed. After that, this trial was called the God's Shackles by our descendants. Yun Yang and Ji Lingxi murmured at the same time, God's Shackles. Yes, it's the Empyrean Shackles. If you don't reach this level that's close to the demigod realm, it's impossible to touch this special layer of restriction. Ling Xiaozui sighed softly. Since the beginning of time, how many tens of thousands of years have passed? Countless geniuses have stopped before this stage. On the path of cultivation, the most important thing is talent. However, this first challenge has eliminated more than 90% of the people in this world. Another 90% of the people in this world will be eliminated in the first challenge. Another 90% will be eliminated in the next challenge. Another 90% will be eliminated in the next challenge. Another 90% will be eliminated in the next challenge of the Dao realm. Another 90% will be eliminated in the Dao realm. So, the probability of a Xiuzha that can advance to natural shackles is not 1 in 10,000, but not 1 in a million. Yes, it's that harsh. So far, this is Tianshan Continent's overall level classification. Ling Xiaozui said, Dugu and I were exceptionally lucky. Dugu was infatuated with love when he entered the martial path and walked the path of passion. Infatuated with love, he was infatuated with martial arts. Because of this, he broke through the limit of chakras by chance. I don't know how many chakras he broke through, but it was because of this that he entered a brand new cultivation path. As for me, I entered the path of swordsmanship completely. In order to break through this challenge, Ling Xiaozui looked as if he could not bear to recall the past as he shook his head with a bitter smile. Each time I tried to break through, I always pierced a chakra in my body with my sword. In total, I tried 15 times. Then, with the help of the gentle water and the power of the divine fish, I really broke through the barrier of God's shackles. My constant search for the divine fish was actually to consolidate my realm. Yes, the 7-scaled fairy. Ling Xiaozui looked at Yun Yang with a smile. It's also because of this that I often come to Tiantang City and get to know younger sister Yun. It was also because of this that I met you, young brother. Yun Yang nodded and smiled faintly. Recalling the time when he met Ling Xiaozui while fishing, a long time had passed. He had grown from a small shrimp to where he was now. For a moment it felt like a dream. Ji Lingxi asked from the side, this is still different from my situation. When I cultivate, there won't be a situation where I can't absorb mystical chi or have mystical chi leak out. My cultivation base and capability have been increasing steadily. I only want to know now what's the so-called path ahead. Ling Xiaozui said, don't be hasty, don't be hasty. We're about to get to the main topic. Regarding the next step in cultivation, I've explored many times. I've even sneaked into the bound of universe to ask around. Although the process was fraught with danger, I've gained something in the end. I have to say that the bound of universe's information has a longer history than that of Tianshan Continent. After a few twists and turns, I've managed to find some reliable information. It's only then that I've uncovered the mystery of Tianshan Continent's cultivation. Ji Lingxi and Yun Yang could not help but perk up their ears. Both of them realized that what Ling Xiaozui was about to reveal might be the greatest secret in this world. It said that Tianshan Continent didn't have this name many thousands of years ago. Back then, it was actually called Shenshen Continent. Shenshen Continent? What kind of name is that? Yin Yang smacked his lips and chuckled. It's not as good as Tianshan Continent. Ling Xiaozui said, "What's the use of having a nice name?" Xianshan Continent produced many masters who could dominate the world back then. That was glory, that was splendor. Legend has it that there was a young man who was born as a debauchee like you. And he was different from you. He was a real debauchee in the beginning, the kind that couldn't be saved. But the moment he woke up to reality, he worked hard and improved by leaps and bounds. His cultivation rose in a straight line, like a hot knife cutting through butter. Success came naturally when the conditions were right. In the end, he even became the ruler of the Xianshan continent. And he completed all of this in less than 20 years. The speed of his improvement was not only unprecedented, but also unprecedented. 20 years. Yun Yang and Ji Lingxi looked at each other and saw the shock in each other's eyes. To transcend the mortal realm and become the ruler of a world in less than 20 years. Is this really possible? It sounded like a myth, a fantasy, a ridiculous legend that had been passed down. Chapter 763. You didn't hear wrongly. It really is less than 20 years, but I'm not sure exactly how many years it was. After all, it's been too long, and the specific timeline has long been buried in the long river of history. Only the biographies recorded that this lord was incredibly talented back then, but his way of doing things was his own way. His way of doing things was between good and evil, neither good nor evil. Most of his actions were based on his own preferences. It was also because of his eccentric personality that he was called the evil monarch by the later generations. After a long time, no one dared to mention his real name. All the records related to him only addressed him respectfully as Lord Monarch. Ling Xiaozui's face was filled with reverence. Evil monarch, Yun Yang murmured. He felt that the name was straightforward and indescribably domineering. This Lord Evil Monarch has left too many legends in the Xianshan continent. Later on, due to his exceedingly high cultivation base, this heaven and earth started to be unable to withstand this Lord Evil Monarch's supreme might. In the end, Lord Evil Monarch left with his beautiful family, shattering the void and leaving. The entire continent can't contain one person, supreme might? Yun Yang could not help but gape, his eyes filled with fascination. It's true. According to the ancient records, the current cultivation records of the Xianshan continent are mystical practitioners from 1st to 9th mystic, followed by silver mystic, gold mystic, jade mystic, earth mystic, heaven mystic, immortal mystic, supreme, superior supreme, honor, saint, and so on. The level of cultivation at that time could be said to be extremely thorough. Compared to the peak of our cultivation at the 9th heaven of the Tao realm, it was probably above the Supreme Master at that time. It should be around that level. The profound sky continent has long since lost the inheritance of the specific cultivation methods to go further up the path of cultivation. There is no way to continue and it has come to an abrupt end. Ling Xiaozui sighed. What do you mean by losing the legacy and stopped abruptly? Ji Lingxi widened her round eyes. The path of cultivation has existed since time immemorial. It has always been passed down to the next generation. Since it once existed, it's impossible for it to disappear, let alone for all of it to vanish. How absurd is it to say that it has come to an abrupt end? Ling Xiaozui chuckled dryly. Ridiculous? At first glance, it does sound absurd, unreasonable, and even more unreasonable. However, this is the truth, the reality. Speaking of which, this matter is also related to the evil monarch. At that time, before the evil monarch broke through the void, he did something earth-shattering, saving the lives of the entire continent. It can be said that his merits are immeasurable, and he has blessed the common people. However, after the old man left this place, who knows how many years later the foundation he left behind attracted the covetous eyes of some people. There's nothing strange about that. Everyone in the world is forgetful and greedy. If it doesn't involve their own benefits, they might remember the good things they had done in the past. But once the benefits are enough, they can do anything. The so-called friendship is just a bargaining chip for betrayal. What's more tragic is that not only did those people covet the old man's legacy, but they also tried to erase the traces of the evil monarch in this world. The person who orchestrated this matter was very resourceful, spending hundreds of years to build a sect to educate the people. He purposely magnified the word evil in Lord Evil Monarch's name, calling him an unorthodox devil. The so-called salvation was merely a coincidence, not a deliberate act. At that time, it had been far too long since Lord had left. The foundation that Lord had left behind had long been shaken by the wind and rain, and had lost its former glory. Only a few descendants were left to defend it. At that time, the people of the world had already forgotten Lord Evil Monarch's grace of saving the world, intentionally or unintentionally, and stood on the opposite side. It was also at that time that the descendant of one of the evil monarch's old friends, the continent's wealthiest man, did not hesitate to spend all his wealth to protect Lord Evil Monarch's legacy. However, he was targeted by the people and his family was destroyed in the end. Perhaps the heavens are watching the actions of man. At the very last moment, the continent was in the palm of the person's hand, gathering all forces to encircle Lord Evil Monarch's final legacy. Lord Evil Monarch returned from his travels in the galaxy and encountered this matter. Should this return be said to be a coincidence or a misfortune, a coincidence or an inevitability? After understanding the current state of affairs, the Lord Evil Monarch sneered and said, "I could save the world back then, I can destroy it now. Since the kindness has been forgotten, let the hatred hang in your heart forever." Before his words could echo in the air, the voice was still ringing in his ears. Lord Evil Monarch had already turned his hand, annihilating all the Shen continent's living beings who had participated in the opposition. After a few breaths, all the skilled cultivators of this world had perished without exception. Yin-Yang sucked in a cold breath. All the opposing forces of the continent, annihilated with a flip of the palm. According to what Ling Xiaozui had said earlier, the person with the intention had connected almost everyone in the continent, which meant that everyone in the world was against him. Did that not mean that the entire continent had been annihilated with a flip of the palm? Billions of lives were gone just like that? Just a flip of the palm? In the end, only a few small fries who were not qualified to participate in this incident were left. More than 90% of the total population of this world had been wiped out. In the end, the Lord Evil Monarch smiled and said, "You don't want any traces of me to remain in this continent, you've tried your best to wipe them out completely. I shouldn't have gone along with your wishes, but all of you have perished, your wishes have come to nothing. However, the living beings of this continent have treated me and my descendants like this. If my traces and legacy were to remain on this continent, it would be a form of blasphemy to me instead." Therefore, the Lord Evil Monarch had actually opened up a new world out of thin air with a flip of his hand. He had moved all the traces that belonged to him into that world. Then he had named this new world, the Bound of Universe. Ling Xiaozui looked at Yin-Yang and said, "This is the Bound of Universe. The origin of the Bound of Universe. Do you understand now? Why doesn't Tianshan continent have a higher level of legacy? It's because the Lord Evil Monarch hated this continent so much that with a single thought, he had wiped out the entire continent's profound legacy, leaving only the portion below honor level. Therefore, to go a step further or even a few more steps, we must ascend to the Bound of Universe." Ling Xiaozui chuckled humorlessly. Our current cultivation base should be at the level of honor level if we were to be in the Bound of Universe, but we still don't know which level of honor we're at. After all, we don't have any cultivation methods above that here. Even if we were to go to the Bound of Universe, we'd have to join a certain sect or serve a certain family to be able to learn them. This is also the main reason why I've never wanted to go to the Bound of Universe. The people of the Bound of Universe don't welcome guests from Tianshan continent. To them, we're cultivators from the gods' forsaken land. Our wild ambitions are despicable. Ling Xiaozui chuckled bitterly, his expression bitter. Chapter 764. Yun-Yang understood Ling Xiaozui's feelings very well. Even if one were to disregard his identity and background, he was still someone who had ruled over the Tianshan continent for a very long time after all. If he were to head to the Bound of Universe, if he was unwilling to be mediocre, he would need to find a force to rely on. They could either become an ordinary disciple of a sect and slowly climb up, or become a vassal of an aristocratic family. What was the difference between that and a servant? Not to mention the fact that he was someone who came from the forsaken land of the gods. It was truly unbearable. If that was the case, not only was Ling Xiaozui unwilling to go, Yun-Yang was also unwilling to go. But if he didn't go, he would never be able to take another step forward. This was a dead knot with no solution. How big is the Bound of Universe? Yin-Yang asked in a low voice. It's very, very big. It's hard to describe with words. Ling Xiaozui chuckled humorlessly. It was a coincidence that I used a treasure to sneak in. Luckily, what I wanted to know wasn't exactly a secret in the Bound of Universe. But that treasure of mine was destroyed when my identity was exposed and I fell out of the spatial rift while being chased. If we want to go to the Bound of Universe now, it's actually very simple. All we have to do is concentrate all of our cultivation base and trigger the heaven and earth's response. Then, a spatial tear will automatically open and we can enter the Bound of Universe through the spatial tear. But, there's a high chance that the people of the Bound of Universe will discover our identity and background. Once our identities are exposed, we'll become lowly commoners. Lowly commoners from the forsaken land of the gods. Dugucho sighed as well. That's not right. If that's the case, how did Lei Dongtian come down that day? Moreover, he boasted that his cultivation was not ordinary. Although he was not at the peak, he was still a first-rate expert. Yun Yang asked in surprise. Lei Dongtian's cultivation base was impressive at the time, but now it seems that it's nothing much. How could he come and go freely? There must be something fishy about this. What's more, sixth brother Supreme Thunder also came from the bound of universe. His cultivation was even lower, but he still came to the Tianshan continent. How could there be no reason for this? Ling Xiaozue pondered and said, there must be some special way. However, I don't believe that someone with a cultivation base lower than ours can travel freely between the bound of universe and Tianshan continent. There must be many restrictions. Oh, Yun Yang replied thoughtfully. Perhaps this could explain why Lei Dongtian did not come back after he left, right? But what could be the reason? Speaking of cultivation base, Ling Xiaozue looked at Yun Yang and Ji Lingxi and said, both of us old fellows have gone through a lot of hardships and countless life and death experiences of our forefathers before we were lucky enough to break through the shackles of God. What about you two young ones? Dugucho was perplexed as well as he said, that's right. A situation like the both of you is unprecedented and unheard of. Previously, I was still thinking that Yun Yang might have been reborn because of the residence of 9 Supremes, but looking at it carefully, Miss G's cultivation base has obviously broken through the immortal shackles a step earlier. The depth of her cultivation base now is probably even higher than both of us old fellows. This is really strange. As he spoke, he grabbed Yun Yang's hand to feel his pulse and probe Yun Yang's body bit by bit with his refined mystical qi. Yun Yang was not bothered at all and did not resist. He was puzzled by his own physical condition as well. However, Dugucho had only probed halfway when he stopped abruptly. Lifting his head, he looked at Yun Yang like he had seen a ghost. How many chakras have you awakened? Or do you actually have a unique physique? Yun Yang scratched his head. This junior really doesn't know. This junior only had 7 chakras in the beginning. Then, through many coincidences and this incident, I became what I am now. May I ask how many chakras have both of you awakened, seniors? As he spoke, he looked at Ling Xiaozue and Dugucho. Dugucho did not speak, but Ling Xiaozue said honestly, I've awakened 15 until now. Let me see. As he spoke, he began to feel Yun Yang's pulse as well. Similarly, before his mystical qi could complete a full cycle in Yun Yang's meridians, it suddenly jolted and was withdrawn. Lifting his head, he stared at Yun Yang in bewilderment, his breathing labored. You've awakened all of them? He turned to look at Dugucho, who nodded with an aggrieved expression. The two experts were speechless for a good while. Yun Yang had only circulated his qi halfway, but he could already tell that he had awakened at least 100 chakras. What would happen if all of them were completed? How many chakras were there in a human body? Dugucho's face was contorted as he said, I've awakened 16, and it took me more than 570 years. I haven't improved since 260 years ago. Ji Lingxi extended her hand excitedly and said, have you seen how many chakras I've awakened? Are there any more than Yun Yang? Ling Xiaozue felt her pulse as well and shuddered as if he had been electrocuted. His eyeballs almost popped out of their sockets. You've awakened all of them as well? Even more than Yun Yang? What's going on? What? Dugucho stood up in shock and grabbed Ji Lingxi's hand to feel as well. Then he plopped down on the chair, cold sweat dripping from his forehead. How can such a thing happen in this world? This is killing me. The two experts exchanged a look. Ji Lingxi said weakly, I don't know about Yun Yang. Anyway, it seems like I was born with a mess of chakras. I can't even count how many of them there are. I was judged to be unable to go far in the cultivation journey early on, so my family didn't like me since a long time ago. It's only recently that I felt better after a few days of good sleep. It would have been better if she had not said it. Now that she had said it, Ling Xiaozue and Dugucho felt like they were about to break down. If that was the case, then your chakras were fully manifested when you were born and your chakras were cleared after a few days of sleep? We've been cultivating our entire lives, but it's not even comparable to your reincarnation. If you're so arrogant, why don't you just go to heaven and show off to us country bumpkins? What's the point? Is it really that interesting? The two unparalleled experts could not understand their current state at all. There was an indescribable sense of grievance. This was the first time in their lives that they had experienced such a feeling. It was too unfair. If you guys had also gone through arduous cultivation and experienced many things to awaken so many chakras, we wouldn't have to feel so bad. However, what was the meaning of awakening the moment you were born? What was the meaning of this? Cheating? Was this all there was to it? The god's shackles that had stumped everyone else didn't even exist for the two of you? Compared to the two men's speechlessness, Yun Yang and Ji Lingxi were excited, even eager to try. Chapter 765. Ling Xiaozui snorted and said angrily, "It doesn't matter if we spar. I haven't exercised for a long time. Cultivation base is linked to combat power, but it's not the same." Dugucho snorted as well and said with a tilt of his head, "That's right. Even if our cultivation bases are the same, there's still a difference in the combat power we can unleash. Whether our foundation is stable or not, our state of mind is still very different. In other words, both of you may be gifted, but compared to our years of accumulation you're still a long way off." Ji Lingxi was excited, rubbing her palms together, almost ready to yell at Yun Yang. "Don't let me go first." Yun Yang stopped her hurriedly. "Let me spar with the two seniors first. I'll spar with you after I'm done. We can compare our strengths this way, and it's safer too." Ji Lingxi said angrily, "How can you be like this? The two seniors have promised me. What are you doing interfering?" Yun Yang snorted but did not answer. Instead he rolled his eyes at her. Ji Lingxi, who was glared at, fell silent, feeling wronged. She understood what Yun Yang meant instantly and understood that this was indeed the only way. If the red glow on her were to burst forth during the spar, it would be a life-threatening incident. The strange red glow had only shown Yun Yang in the form of recoil so far. It did not seem to be fatal, but in reality, Yun Yang was too resilient. With the help of his countless resources and cheats, he was too resilient. There were only two of them. The other one who had suffered the recoil from the red glow had already reincarnated a long time ago. If the red light really came out of nowhere during the sparring session and killed Ling Xiaozui and Dugucho right away, it would be a grave matter. With the intensity of the red glow, the probability of danger was at least 70 to 80%, even if it was not 100%. Such a huge risk could never be taken. Outside, Fang Mafei, Lao Mei, and the rest were busy arranging food and wine while Bai Yishue had gone all over the city to purchase unique and rare ingredients. Xiao Xiaoqing paced around with his arms behind his back, sniffing occasionally and mumbling with a frown, "Where is the residence of Yun's fine wine? Why can't I smell the fragrance of good wine in such a big mansion? This is different from what we agreed on." Towards this fellow, Fang Mafei and Lao Mei had gone from welcoming him respectfully and treating him as an honored guest to ignoring him and treating him with disdain. Although this fellow was advanced in age, he was still a generation older than both of them. They were of the same generation as Bai Yishue, so of course Xiao Xiaoqing was a generation older than them. In terms of age, this fellow was even older than Ling Xiaozui. After all, he was Dugu Chao's only disciple. However, Fang Mafei and Lao Mei had no intention of taking this fellow seriously, much less treating him as an elder. He was just a clown. When they first met, it was just a greeting. "Senior, you don't look old at all," but it actually made this guy laugh heartily and boast about his appearance for a long time. Others would only compliment him once or twice. Was there anyone else who would brag about themselves for a long time? Not to mention, this fellow wanted to make Fang Mafei, who had praised his youthful looks, his sworn brother. Fang Mafei was on the verge of breaking down. "If I were to become sworn brothers with you, Bai Yishue and I would have to break off our friendship tomorrow." And this was the lightest state. Once he recovered, he would have to use his passive sword to greet him. Even if he wanted to harm someone, this was not the way to do it. Yun Xiaoyao would also occasionally come to check on the progress. This meal was truly incredible. This was the first time King Yun found out the true identity of the two middle-aged men who had stayed in his house for a few days. Ling Xiaozui, Dugucho. Lord Yun almost broke down when he heard these two names. They were the legends of the pugilistic world, and they were the ones that hadn't expired yet. Now they were all living in my courtyard. Therefore, King Yun had decided to accompany Yun Yang personally tonight. It would be best if these two people could give Yun Yang some pointers on his martial arts. King Yun would never have thought that Yun Yang and Ling Xiaozui were already sparring in Yun Yang's small yard with its tightly shut door. This could also be considered as guidance in another sense. Please? Please? Facing the current Yun Yang, Ling Xiaozui dared not let his guard down. Yun Yang was of the same level as him now. Even if he analyzed it carefully, he could still be a few levels higher than Yun Yang, but Yun Yang had too many trump cards up his sleeves. Ling Xiaozui did not belittle himself at all when he said that if Yun Yang were to unleash all of his abilities in a life-and-death battle, it would be hard to predict who would emerge victorious. Perhaps Ling Xiaozui thought that if that was the case he would most likely be the one to be defeated. Luckily this was only a sparring session. Yes, it was only a sparring session, a pure sparring session. In spite of this, Ling Xiaozui still decided to withdraw his sword first. Holding it in his hand, he said with a smile, "This is the first time in my life that I can draw my sword before the actual battle. There's no harm in being careful. Although I don't want to admit it, I have to." Yunyang replied, "Similarly, this is also the first time that I'm embarrassed to draw my saber before a sparring session." Ling Xiaozui was speechless. Dugucho was speechless as well. "Sparring? Why don't you dare draw your saber? Are you trying to act cool?" "My saber?" Yunyang chuckled humorlessly. "It's too sharp. I'm afraid it'll destroy Senior's sword with a single touch. Let's not use our own weapons then. Let's just use ordinary steel swords and sabers." Ling Xiaozui swore that this was the first time in his life that someone had looked down on him like this. In this world, who would dare say that they could break Ling Xiaozui's sword with a single strike? This was simply absurd, deranged, and the ravings of a lunatic. Now, however, Yunyang had said it so openly. He was even a little embarrassed, as if he had taken advantage of the situation. At the same time, Ling Xiaozui dared not say, "Let's just use our own sabers and swords, there's no need to hold back." He had seen Yunyang's saber before. It was incomparably sharp. Although his sword was also an elite among swords, it paled in comparison to Yunyang's saber. At most he could barely parry it. If it were to clash head-on it would be over. If it were the old Yunyang he could protect his treasured sword with his thick cultivation base and pull back before the sword was damaged. However, this fellow's cultivation base had improved tremendously now. He was at a delicate juncture where he could not control his strength at all. Perhaps his lifelong partner would be destroyed by this fellow's saber. Therefore, then let's use ordinary swords and sabers. Ling Xiaozui's words made Dugucho raise his eyes to look at him for a long time. The meaning in his gaze was inexplicably strange, complicated, and indescribable. Ling Xiaozui flushed from his stare. "You, Ling Xiaozui, don't have the confidence to protect your sword when you're facing a young boy like this?" Chapter 766. Ling Xiaozui said fiercely, "If you have the guts, use your own sword when you spar with him later. It's the easiest to wield and you can wield it freely." Dugucho snorted and rolled his eyes. "Do you think I'm stupid?" Ling Xiaozui was exasperated. "If you're not stupid, why are you looking at me like that? What do you mean? Are you stupid?" Ling Xiaozui's stance was natural, leisurely, elegant, and magnanimous. No matter what sword it was, as long as it was in his hands, even if it was a broken piece of metal, it would be a divine sword. It would be a lethal weapon that could split mountains and oceans. On the other hand, the saber in Yunyang's hand was not as eye-catching. It was just an ordinary saber, nothing out of the ordinary. "Come on," Ling Xiaozui said casually, "let me see how much you've improved." Yunyang did not hold back. His cultivation base had suddenly skyrocketed and what he needed the most now was an opponent like Ling Xiaozui. To Yunyang, this sparring match was of utmost importance. Yunyang's saber light flickered as a wave of saber light bloomed. Majestic mystical qi gushed out like a tsunami. The ordinary saber actually glowed brilliantly. Raising the saber, Yunyang hollered, "This is called the merciless blade." A cold gleam seemed to descend from the heavens. It was only a flash of lightning, but it felt like heaven and earth had been split into two. The stance seemed to be able to split the earth beneath his feet into two, yet the saber's force did not stop there. Merciless indeed. Ling Xiaozui's sword light flickered as he met the strike without evading. Just as they came into contact, however, he immediately felt that the attack was endless. What surprised Ling Xiaozui even more was the indescribable force contained within the strike. It was as if it had locked on to the target's spirit, qi, and spirit. An unparalleled saber art. Ling Xiaozui's eyes shone. Although Ling Xiaozui was impressed by the saber truth, destiny's starting form, he had still countered it with a single move. After 7 to 8 changes, the tip of his sword had blocked the saber's edge and pushed it forward. This was the first time since Yunyang had comprehended the destiny blade that his move had been countered by his opponent, to the point where he had to face a forceful counterattack. In spite of this, Ling Xiaozui could not counterattack directly against this simple slash. Instead, he had used 7 to 8 variations. It looked easy to the onlookers, but Dugucho, who was watching from the side, was shocked. Who was Ling Xiaozui? He was a martial arts grandmaster. To put it bluntly, Ling Xiaozui would probably be able to counter any technique in this world before he could execute it halfway and counter it back at him. Within a single sword strike, it was the right thing to do to counter the enemy's moves. Now, there were so many variations in his starting stance against Yun Yang. This shouldn't be the case. Yun Yang sheathed his saber. Merciless Tao. The saber light was like a swimming dragon, circling and flickering. The saber light turned into a path leading to the heavens, filled with a lonely atmosphere and an aloof coldness. Anyone who walked on this path would be mercilessly chopped down. Ling Xiaozui's feet moved, changing his position for 17 to 18 times in an instant, but he still could not shake off the saber's sharp pursuit. Surprise flashed in his eyes as he moved again, the sword light whistling as he launched another counterattack. Sword to the south. Ling Xiaozui had struck. Du Guqiao's eyes narrowed. Du Guqiao was well aware of Ling Xiaozui's initial plan. Rather than calling it a spar, it would be more accurate to say that Ling Xiaozui was using his profound cultivation base and years of experience to guide Yun Yang's saber art. It would be even better if he could consolidate his cultivation base through this battle. These were exactly what Yun Yang needed the most since he had just improved too quickly. It was like a divine sword that had taken shape and needed to be hammered to remove impurities so that it could be forged into an unparalleled blade. Ling Xiaozui should be playing the role of the sledgehammer. Since it was to be guided, it did not matter if he drew his sword or not. He only needed to deal with it with a tight defense and comment after that. However, even Du Guqiao did not expect that Ling Xiaozui would be forced to draw his sword in the second move. It was obvious that it was impossible to nullify this peerless saber strike that was laced with the cold charm of Tao if he were to simply deal with it. With a clang, the saber and the sword clashed. With a flip of his body, Yun Yang swung his saber outwards. A glint of saber light scattered outwards, scattering into a sky full of fireflies before falling down like a sky full of meteors. It was as if it had formed a world of its own. Saber lakes. Ling Xiaozui did not budge as he hollered, drunken sword piercing the stars. The long sword emitted specks of sword radiance. His wrist shook rapidly, and tens of millions of sword radiance counterattacked, successfully canceling out the countless saber radiance derived from the saber mundane world. However, his face had become completely solemn. He could only defend against this attack with his profound cultivation base and rich experience. If it had been someone slightly weaker than him, the only option left would probably be to retreat quickly. Furthermore, he might not even be able to retreat in time. Life and death in a thought. Yun Yang's voice reminded him. Then another ferocious slash was unleashed. The saber light filled the sky like the Milky Way hanging upside down, its power even stronger than saber lakes. Indeed. Ling Xiaozui sucked in a deep breath. The main intention of the previous attack was to force the opponent to retreat. If the opponent had chosen to retreat, he would have to pay a considerable price when faced with this attack that followed up with victory. At the very least, he would be flustered and flustered. This is a strike that follows up with victory. It's best to use it when one has the upper hand. Even if it can't kill the enemy immediately, it can immediately turn the situation into a victory. Ling Xiaozui exclaimed. With his experience and vision, he could naturally see the ingenuity of this attack. Furthermore, Yun Yang had yet to unleash his full potential due to certain factors. If he were to unleash his full potential, appended river of blood. Yun Yang's elegant voice rang out again. Accompanying his voice was a towering saber light that swept across the sky. Ling Xiaozui could only feel a river of flowing blood appearing before his eyes, falling from the sky in an unstoppable manner. Great saber. Ling Xiaozui could not help but exclaim in awe as he faced the incoming attack. There was no other reason than the fact that this attack was too brutal and domineering. Even with Ling Xiaozui's state of mind, he could not help but shudder in fear. Even though Yun Yang could not unleash the full potential of this skill, the horrifying sight of the river of blood falling from the sky, connecting heaven and earth and the pool of blood in the mortal realm, was enough to shake anyone's state of mind. Ling Xiaozui changed his state of mind instantly, reciting the art of ice to calm himself down. He closed his eyes, ignoring the strange phenomenon of the pool of blood before him. The sword in his hand hummed as it drew an impenetrable wall made entirely of refined sword light, using all its power for defense. He even took 2 steps back to reserve some buffer space, preparing for a counterattack once the attack was slightly delayed. Honestly, Ling Xiaozui's response was ingenious. Even if it were Du Guqiao or Jun Moyan, they would not have a better situation. It was a pity that Yun Yang did not wait for the appended river of blood to finish. He retracted the saber in his hand at the right time and another strange arc was formed. Chapter 767. Reincarnation under the saber. The meaning of this move was simple. No matter who you were or how strong an expert you were, reincarnate under this saber. Ling Xiaozui was shocked once again. Logically speaking, even if it was a peak expert in the world, when faced with the unparalleled viciousness of the inverted blood river, the blood world's progenitor, 80 to 90% of the time, the priority would be to defend, and at most leave a bit of strength to defend and counterattack. Ling Xiaozui, however, had an experienced eye. He had seen through the move before it could be countered. Not only had he hidden an attack within a defense, he had also laid down a space for counterattack. Once the opponent's attack was over, he would use the buffer space he had left to launch a counterattack. It was a marvelous counterattack. Despite such a marvelous counterattack, it was still within the prediction of the creator of Saber Truth, Destiny Blade. Before the inverted river of blood reached its end, a peculiar whirlpool had manifested and formed an eerie aura field that separated both of them, causing Ling Xiaozui's subsequent plan to fall through. If he had continued with his original plan and launched a pursuit now, he would have fallen into this peculiar aura field and be restrained. The loss outweighed the gain. It was also at the moment the aura field was formed that Yun Yang's saber made a comeback, reversing the aura field and forming a new wave of counterattack. It was a marvelous saber technique that predicted the enemy's every move. It was marvelous. Even with Ling Xiaozui's many years of battle experience, he could quickly tell that no one could escape the range of the saber, no matter who it was that faced this move. Only by resisting it with one's true cultivation base could one hope to escape. However, resisting it was equivalent to facing a strange, contradictory aura field at the same time. How could one know the direction of the attacker's saber and where the tip of the saber that controlled the aura would land? In fact, this was the greatest danger of this move. Ling Xiaozui howled, his body spinning rapidly. Not being able to break the technique did not mean that he had to take it on passively. Using his spinning speed and dense sword energy, Ling Xiaozui constructed sword mountains that protected him from the wind and rain. This was the best way to neutralize the opponent's attack with the purest and tightest defense, and it could even be said to be the best way to break the current attack. However, there was a precondition, and that was that the opponent had to have a much higher cultivation than the attacker. Such a passive and extreme defense would definitely consume far more of his cultivation than his opponent. If their cultivations were the same, it would be impossible for him to completely withstand this move. To put it more clearly, the defender relied on his great strength to deal with things. He was strong enough to defeat 10 people. Dugucho, who was watching from the side, had his eyes widened. Ling Xiaozui had suppressed his ability to a level similar to Yun Yang's, yet he was already at a disadvantage within a few moves. It had only been 4 moves and Ling Xiaozui was already forced to elevate his realm to deal with it. I can't believe there's such a mystical saber skill in this world. Dugucho watched from the side. As the saying went, the onlooker had a clearer view of the situation. Putting himself in Ling Xiaozui's shoes, he wondered if there was any other way to deal with this move other than using Ling Xiaozui's method. As his thoughts raced, he had to admit that there was no other way to deal with it. Any other way would only put him in a more disadvantageous position and hasten his own defeat. Besides, after witnessing it with his own eyes, if he were to go up and face the same move again, he would have no other way to deal with it. This saber skill is truly marvelous. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed that there's more than one such marvelous technique. Dugucho sighed as he watched and studied. Each of Yun Yang's saber skills was marvelous, filled with contradictions and impossibilities, but it was also because of this that they were the most perfect embodiment. After all, was it not perfection to have contradictions and impossibilities? Dugucho stared unblinkingly at Yun Yang's way of wielding his saber. To his surprise, he realized that each form and style of Destiny Blade contained more than 10, 20 or even more methods of channeling energy and qi. All of the methods of circulating qi and circulating breath were operating in a way that defied common sense, yet they also carried a certain set of rules. If one or a few of them were to be forcefully operated, the practitioner's meridians would only explode and he would die without a doubt. However, with the dozens of qi channeling methods before him, it formed an unusually unique cycle. Not only was it harmless, it was beneficial instead. It was such a qi channeling method that increased the power of the technique by several folds. The person who created this saber skill is definitely not human. Dugucho was filled with reverence. It's God. If it wasn't for God's wisdom and understanding, how could he have created a flawless saber technique that should not belong to the mortal world? With a soft clang, Ling Xiaozui's sword and Yun Yang's saber finally clashed. When the offensive move could not be retracted and the defensive move was flawless, the final result would be a clash of weapons, a decisive battle of strength. Ling Xiaozui did not exert his strength forcefully as the saber and sword clashed. He took 3 steps back, the sword in his hand swaying to protect his entire body. He was still defending while attacking, his defense impenetrable. His aura did not diminish but grew instead as he was ready to strike. Unexpectedly, Yun Yang's body had floated 100 feet into the air, borrowing the force of the recoil. Then, the tip of the saber pointed downwards and the blade swung horizontally, falling from the sky. There was not the slightest hint of smoke or fire, like the wind from the 9 heavens, blowing into the mortal world soundlessly. If one did not feel it carefully, one would not even be able to feel the breeze. Perhaps, it should be said that when one could not feel it, this gentle breeze had already blown through the mountains and rivers, blowing through the mortal world. It was silent and gentle. The breeze was gentle but it was everywhere, not a village. That's right, this is wind beyond the sky. Yun Yang's clear voice rang out amidst the saber light. Ling Xiaozui's expression was unprecedentedly cautious. As he drew his sword, the materialized sword light at the tip of the sword grew another 3 feet. It was as if he was facing a formidable enemy. He was giving it his all, displaying his lifetime's worth. Ling Xiaozui understood very well that although the gentle breeze that caressed one's face looked gentle and harmless, it could actually turn into lightning and thunder at any time, turning into a violent storm. However, there was still the same problem: one would never know when the wind would change. It could be at the next moment or at any time. This was the most fatal and unsolvable problem. Chapter 768. Since he could not grasp when the enemy would change his attack accordingly, he would choose to deal with the situation by remaining unchanged and protect himself as best as he could before thinking of a follow-up counterattack. Deal with the situation by remaining unchanged, or rather, deal with the situation with one change. The breeze turned into a cold whirlwind, the chilliness pulsing erratically. Ling Xiaozui could only feel chills all over him. The saber seemed to be able to slice through any part of his body. However, there was no turning back now. Yun Yang had vanished along with the breeze, leaving no trace behind. Even the source of the attack was gone. He could not even take the risk and counterattack the source of the attack. Such a change was not due to Yun Yang activating his cloud manifestation, but it was a natural phenomenon formed by the saber-tooth, stratospheric breeze. With Ling Xiaozui's level of attainment, he could still discern this clearly. Understanding it was one thing, but how to deal with it was another matter. It was the same logic as knowing the cause and effect but not being able to deal with it. At this moment, Ling Xiaozui even had a thought: how nice would it be to let Dugu Chou guide him? Why should I stand up for him? He seemed to be regretting it a little. It was a pity that people would only feel regret after facing it. It was too late, it was futile, there was nothing they could do but sigh helplessly. Ling Xiaozui, who had fallen into an extremely disadvantageous situation, steadied himself and continued to construct the sword mountain to protect himself. He even changed the attribute of his sword energy from ferocious to gentle, leaving as soon as it touched the opponent. No matter which direction or position the opponent came from, he would always have a sword to counter it. Although there was no hope of counterattacking, there was no doubt that he would not lose. Although he would not win, he would not lose either. Ding, 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 ding. Dozens or even hundreds of clashes of saber and sword could be heard, but there was only the soft sound of silver needles falling to the ground. Ling Xiaozui heaved a sigh of relief, breaking out in cold sweat. It was fortunate that Yun Yang had not perfected the technique yet, or perhaps his cultivation base was still insufficient to unleash the true essence of the technique. Thus, Ling Xiaozui's line of defense remained intact. Otherwise, this technique alone would have been enough to bury his grievances on the spot and tarnish his reputation. The exquisiteness of this move had already reached the acme of perfection. It was completely unfathomable. If one had to evaluate this move, there was only one word that could describe it: it didn't belong to the human world. The next moment, an abnormally fierce murderous aura suddenly rushed over. It was an extremely violent and tyrannical aura, as if it wanted to slaughter the entire world. This move is called Mountain of Bones. Yun Yang spun in the air, his saber light dancing in the air, flinging out hundreds of saber rays that were hundreds of feet long. When he turned around again, the saber in his hand drew a strange internal arc, aiming straight for Ling Xiaozui. It was the most direct and extreme way to cleave the man down. At the same time, the hundreds of beams of saber energy that had been dispersed earlier seemed to have been summoned back to Yun Yang's saber as if they had been summoned. They gathered and flowed towards Yun Yang's saber. Whether it was Ling Xiaozue who was in the field or Dugucho who was outside, their expressions changed drastically. Obviously, this slash had exceeded their understanding of the technique. If the saber technique was broken down, it would be easy to explain. Yun Yang's initial move, the hundreds of saber rays, were an indiscriminate attack that aimed to lock down the target's position and pave the way for the tyrant slash that followed. Other than increasing his attack power to its peak, the tyrant slash that followed could also ensure that the target could not avoid the move and could only face it head-on due to the effect of the dispersed saber light. There was also the convergence of the saber light. It seemed bizarre, but it was still a variation of a high-level cultivator's skill. These were not surprising if they were taken out individually. At most, they were exceptionally exquisite. However, the current situation was indeed a comprehensive deduction of the above. The scattered saber energy that Yun Yang had finally retrieved was not damaged at all and was even slightly strengthened. The converging attack was almost equivalent to merging the hundreds of saber energy earlier into the final slash. It was appalling and unimaginable. No matter how marvelous a technique was, it still had to follow the most basic laws of physics. The saber energy that was released from afar was already released, but how could it be controlled and retrieved after the change of the technique? Both of them thought of the internal arc that Yun Yang had drawn the moment he changed his technique. Could it be that he had retrieved all the hundreds of saber rays that had been released? However, the internal arc should not have been able to repel the external world. How could it have such a whirlpool-like effect? Furthermore, how could it be possible to retrieve the saber energy without any damage? Both of them pondered. To achieve this, one must have gone through countless cycles of circulation that defied common sense in one's body. The thought seemed to be clear in their minds, but the deeper meaning behind it only made them shudder even more. This was completely contrary to the normal concept of cultivation. It was something that shouldn't have happened at all, okay? However, it had happened in Yun Yang's hands just like that. How could reality be so terrifying? Compared to Dugucho, who was not involved and had the leisure to ponder slowly, Ling Xiaozue, who was on the battlefield, did not even have the chance to consider the details. What he could do now was to rely on his rich experience and personal understanding of cultivation to deal with the attack. He turned into a sword light and charged forward, retaliating fiercely. Facing such a saber strike, the only way to survive was to fight to the death. Ling Xiaozue truly felt that what lay before him was a mountain of corpses and a sea of blood. It was a mountain of bones. The technique lived up to its reputation. Just the intense murderous intent and malice was enough to strike fear into any expert's heart and cause them to cower before the battle had even begun. Ling Xiaozue's back was drenched in cold sweat. With a loud boom, the saber and sword clashed once more. At the moment of contact, Ling Xiaozue retreated swiftly as if he was no match for the opponent. His retreating silhouette spun 20 to 30 times in the yard, leaving densely packed deep saber marks wherever he passed. In spite of this, Ling Xiaozue had managed to evade the attack. The killing intent of the attack had been formed and it was locked on by the previous form. There was no way to evade it, so he had to take it head-on. However, if he did so, he would have to face hundreds of saber light converging into a lethal strike. Not only would it be difficult for him to gain the upper hand, there was also the risk of losing and being utterly defeated. Chapter 769. Dugucho, who was watching the battle from the side, praised inwardly. Ling Xiaozue's way of dealing with the situation was exquisite. Dugucho asked himself if he were in Ling Xiaozue's shoes, he would not have been able to react better than Ling Xiaozue, even though he might not have been at a disadvantage. The momentary difference in blocking the attack was so precise that it was breathtaking and terrifying. That was close. Ling Xiaozue, who had successfully passed the test, was sweating inwardly. This child had actually forced me to use 80% of my ability to pass. It would be embarrassing if this went on. He might even be forced to use his lifetime's worth of cultivation based by this child. Moreover, Dugucho was watching from the side. He had been utterly humiliated today. Just as the thought popped into his mind, he felt a chill run down his spine as he turned around. It was the first time he had ever felt such a sense of danger. Even when he and Dugucho were ambushed by explosives at the Four Seasons Tower's headquarters and were surrounded, he had never felt such a sense of urgency. Ling Xiaozue dared not let his guard down. Gathering a mouthful of energy, he spun around quickly, only to see a door appear before him. It was a pitch-black door, with ghastly fog billowing out from within, surging outwards like a gust of wind. The door before him was so real that it made one feel as if they were to step into it, they would no longer be able to return to the mortal realm. This is the door of life and death. The saber light dashed out from the door of life and death like a ghostly dragon before vanishing into thin air, filling the air with murderous intent that was everywhere. It filled the entire space. Just a touch of it would mean that one had walked into the door of life and death. Ling Xiaozui was drenched in cold sweat in the face of such a lethal attack. Without hesitation, he raised his cultivation base to 90% of its level and swore inwardly, "Spar? I'm not going to spar with this monster anymore. Give me pointers. Whoever is willing to do so can do it. I've decided that this good job will be Dugu Chao's alone from now on." Finally, withstanding the attack, Ling Xiaozui felt dizzy as if his body had been hollowed out. Of course, it was not to the extent of danger. If he had reached a point where he could no longer continue, he would have stopped. Therefore, no matter how embarrassing he was, he wouldn't be injured just like that. After all, he still had his cultivation suppressing him. If he really couldn't do anything, he would be able to withstand it with all his might. But the mental pressure was too great. Barely holding on was not a good thing for one's mental state. Although one's mental state needed to be tempered, blindly tempering it would only have the opposite effect. The last move? Yun Yang's voice rang out. Yun Yang was having a hard time as well. Each form of saber truth, Destiny Blade consumed a lot of energy. If it were not for Emmy's support, he might not have been able to complete the 4 forms and 8 styles in one go. Ling Xiaozui sucked in a long deep breath and sprung up into the air. Although he did not have a solid foothold in the air, there was still more space for him to maneuver in midair. Faced with Yun Yang's marvelous techniques, it was never wrong to be more cautious and strategized. 18 levels of hell? As expected, Ling Xiaozui heard the name. Then he suddenly realized that the seemingly real gate of life and death had disappeared. In its place, 6 palaces had appeared out of thin air. 6 towering, majestic, and imposing halls. Each of the palace's doors were wide open, the thousands of ghosts within howling as they tried to rush out. Looking from afar, the 6 palaces were filled with countless strange torture tools. Mountains of knives, oil of pots, cannons, burning with 1,000 cuts. Everything was there. If it had been an ordinary person, they would have been scared out of their wits with just a glance. Ling Xiaozui could clearly feel that the power of the current move was probably the sum of the previous moves, perhaps even more. With such a judgment, Ling Xiaozui hesitated no more. With a loud roar, he pushed his cultivation power that had been boosted to 120%, going all out and fighting with all his might. Embarrassing? He could not care less about embarrassing himself. If he did not go all out, he would be even more embarrassed. Witnessing such an intense battle, Dugu Cho stood up immediately, deep shock written all over his face. Another spectator, Ji Lingxi, watched Yun Yang's battle in the air with her mouth agape. She had been in this state for quite some time, her heart filled with sincere shame. Such a saber skill, how could I withstand it? To think that I had the upper hand every day when I sparred with him, but it was all because he let me win. I would have died 800 times if I were to face such a saber skill. She had overestimated Yun Yang. Her cultivation base was a dozen levels higher than Yun Yang's previously. Even if Yun Yang had an amazing saber skill to counter it, it would still be difficult for him to fight against Ji Lingxi's overwhelming force. Of course, even if Yun Yang had the ability to execute such a lethal move, how could he use it on Ji Lingxi? What if I cut that pretty little face? What would I do? Plop. Ling Xiaozui and Yun Yang landed on the ground at the same time. Yun Yang panted heavily, looking like he had just been scooped out of the water. To Yun Yang, these 5 styles and 10 styles were the first time he had unleashed them with all his might against an opponent of the same realm. He did not have to worry about hurting his opponent at all, he only had to focus on his attacks. He did not even have to worry about the opponent's sudden counterattack. He was like a hidden reef amidst the raging waves in the ocean. No matter how crazed the opponent was, he would not budge. The feeling of extreme output was exhilarating. I can't take it anymore, I'm exhausted. Yun Yang panted, sweat forming a line from his head and face, dripping down, but his face was filled with delight. But it's so satisfying, I've had my fill. Just as he finished speaking, the saber in his hand slipped out of his hand and fell to the ground with a thud. Then he lost his balance and sat down shakily. If he threw away his wet clothes, it would be like throwing an egg against a stone again. A certain someone was completely exhausted now, otherwise he would not have lost his composure like this. Opposite him, Ling Xiaozui was drenched in sweat as well, but his condition was far better than Yun Yang's. His eyes were glued to Yun Yang like he was looking at a monster, unable to look away for a long time. Strictly speaking, it was Ling Xiaozue who had lost by half a move. His green robe, which had almost become his trademark, was left with 6 slashes from the blade. The glints revealed his inner shirt. Even with Ling Xiaozue's pinnacle ability, he had not been able to completely evade the last move. All 6 slashes had landed on the target. If he had not dodged in time, it would not have been just his clothes that had been sliced open. Dugucho stepped forward hurriedly, his eyes wide as he stared at the slashes on Ling Xiaozue's clothes. He did not speak for a moment, the shock in his eyes unconcealable. What a powerful saber skill. I've only realized the vastness of the universe today. To be able to meet such a saber style today, it's a blessing of 3 lifetimes. Ling Xiaozue finally caught his breath and chuckled humorlessly. Shaking his head, beads of sweat rolled down from his forehead. Dugucho nodded in agreement. Brother Ling, you're at least 4 levels higher than Yun Yang. The outcome of this battle is clear. Dugucho had a clear view of the situation as a bystander. Naturally, he had an assessment of Yun Yang's actual ability. I can feel it. Ling Xiaozue nodded with a bitter smile. It's fortunate that it's so much higher. Otherwise what you're seeing now would be a corpse named Ling Xiaozue. Dugucho chuckled humorlessly as well. Both of them turned to look at Yun Yang at the same time. Their gazes were identical. They had seen a ghost. Chapter 770. Yun Yang tried his best to stand up, but his limbs were weak and he could not stand up. Sitting on the ground, he forced a smile and said, "That felt good, that felt good. Senior Ling, we must spar more in the future. This is the first time in my life that I've had such a good spar. If we spar a few more times in the future, my saber skill will definitely improve further." Ling Xiaozue coughed, his expression darkening as he murmured, "Brother Dugu will be with you when we spar in the future. It's already the fortune of 3 lifetimes for me to encounter such a peerless saber skill. How dare I be greedy? It's important to know when to be content." Dugucho said angrily, "Brother Ling, you're being mean." Ling Xiaozue rolled his eyes and walked away, swaying. "I'm not going to keep you company anyway." Outside the courtyard, the battle had long alarmed everyone. Now Fang Mafei, Xiao Xiaoqing, Bai Yishue, Lao Mei, the 4 noble young masters Shengguan Lingxiu, Yun Xiaoyao, and the rest were all standing quietly in the yard watching with their mouths agape. In the air, the 10 Yama kings stared down with their mouths agape, their eyes filled with disbelief. This is Yun Yang? Of course. The one fighting him is Ling Xiaozue? The unrivaled expert Ling Xiaozue acknowledged by the world? Of course. That. First Court King Qingguang was the most shocked. He recalled the first time he met Yun Yang. He shook his head, feeling as if he was dreaming, as if he was dizzy. "You pinch me?" There was a scream. On the street far away. His Majesty's carriage was heading towards the residence of Yun. Looking at the gray fog above the residence of Yun, he murmured, "Why is it so eerie?" Just as they were speaking, they heard a tragic cry. His Majesty shuddered. Qiu Jianhan and Fang Qingtian, 2 veterans who had been through hundreds of battles, shuddered as well, their faces pale. "There's a ghost?" His words were a little inappropriate. The source of the cry was obviously the Yama King, who was many levels higher than a ghost. Dugucho had said that he would not entertain Yun Yang, but deep down he was eager to fight Yun Yang. Dugucho knew very well that Yun Yang's actual cultivation base was much weaker than theirs. It was because of this that they had the leeway to deal with him. If both their cultivation bases were on par, they would have died a long time ago when faced with such a flawless technique. However, in a battle between experts of the same level, there was no mercy. Fighting with all one's might had always been the best way to elevate one's ability quickly. Although Ling Xiaozue's battle today had humiliated him, it had benefited his martial cultivation greatly. However, such an opportunity to improve oneself was rare. Furthermore, Yun Yang possessed such a marvelous saber skill and such a strong oppressive force. If he were to fight with Yun Yang while suppressing his strength to be at the same level as Yun Yang, the benefits would be immense. In short, if he could completely withstand such a marvelous skill with the same level of ability, it would prove that he had a deeper understanding of the path of martial arts. Although this idea might not be realistic, both Dugucho and Ling Xiaozue had high praise for Yun Yang's Destiny Blade. No matter how much effort he put into it, it would be difficult for him to create a technique that could rival Yun Yang's. However, as long as he experienced the oppressive force of such a marvelous skill, it was undeniable that there would be a huge improvement. Dugucho estimated that Ling Xiaozue had already gained a new foundation from the incident at the residence of 9 Supremes. In addition to the battle today, as long as Ling Xiaozui managed to reclaim his gains, his ability would definitely rise to a new level. Perhaps he would even surpass Duguchou. With Duguchou's breadth of mind and realm, he would not hold a grudge or be displeased by this, but it was inevitable that he would be unhappy. After all, he was the long-established, unrivaled expert in the world. Ultimately, he had been completely overpowered by Ling Xiaozui, the unrivaled expert of the new generation. Since Yunyang had expressed his intention to fight again, Duguchou would not let Ling Xiaozui have the upper hand. It was best for them to advance together. However, even if they were to fight again, it would not be today. Yunyang had exhausted himself to his limits in this battle. His body was severely depleted. Even with Emmy's help, he would not be able to recover in a short period of time. Saber Truth, Destiny Blade was marvelous. Every move and style was flawless, but it was because of this that the execution of each move was accompanied by a huge consumption of mystical qi. The last move, 18 levels of hell in particular, had drained all of Yunyang's mystical qi. Even the strength of his bone marrow had been sucked out by that move. The battle had ended. Yunyang, who had breathed a sigh of relief, immediately fell into an extremely lethargic state. For the next hour, not to mention fighting, even his bones seemed to have softened. There's plenty of time for that. Ling Xiaozui and Duguchou were experts in cultivation. Naturally, they knew about Yunyang's current state, so they would not force him. They were not in a hurry either. After all, both of them were going to stay in the residence of Yun for quite some time. There would be plenty of opportunities for them to spar. Yunyang slumped on the chair, completely devoid of energy, but he was inwardly elated. The benefits he had gained from this exchange of pointers were enormous to the extreme. Ling Xiaozui was like a reef in the ocean, a mountain in the storm. He had blocked all the attacks. He was like a giant hammer that struck like lightning. It had allowed Yunyang's understanding of the techniques to improve further. If Yunyang was not exhausted, if he could continue the spar and give Yunyang the chance to perform these techniques over and over again, he would have gained even more. However, Yunyang was not in a hurry. He sat on the chair looking at Ling Xiaozui and Duguchou, chuckling. With these two people here, how could he not have a chance? After that, the banquet that had been arranged earlier arrived as scheduled. There were also 3 uninvited guests participating in the banquet: His Majesty the Emperor and 2 military bigwigs who had suddenly arrived. The 3 of them sat down without hesitation. This was the residence of King Yun, which meant that it was his own home. There was no room for outsiders. Besides, people like Ling Xiaozui and Duguchou needed to be well acquainted, even if they were the rulers of a nation. Seeing that his elder brother, the emperor, had arrived unexpectedly, Yun Xiaoyao had upgraded the banquet to the level of a state banquet, inviting His Majesty to a seat of honor. He had to show some respect. Young Master Yun, this wine? Xiao Xiaoqing was very eager. I heard that you have the wine of the god of wine Feng Xiang'e? Duguchou was filled with frustration when he heard Feng Xiang'e's name. With a kick, Xiao Xiaoqing was sent flying. Feng Xiang'e is a fake, but the wine of the god of wine is real. Ling Xiaozui spoke fairly. Now that I think about it, either the god of wine, Feng Xiang'e, has always been one of Mr. Nian's avatars, or Feng Xiang'e himself has long died in Mr. Nian's hands. It's either one or the other. I can't come up with either answer. Chapter 771. Therefore, the wine in Yunyang's hands is truly the god of wine's last masterpiece in this world, Yunyang said with a laugh. Yunyang laughed and said, Brother Ling is right. In this world, there aren't many people who deserve to drink such wine other than us. Let's just take it as a gift from Mr. Nian. Let's drink all of it. Let's get drunk to our heart's content and we won't go home until we're drunk. As he spoke, he tossed out 10 pots of wine without holding anything back. Ha ha, great. Xiao Xiaoqing guffawed, his eyes glowing. Young Master Yun is a bright man indeed. Then he did something that surprised everyone present. With a click of his finger, he sealed his mystical qi cultivation base completely. Everyone's thoughts raced, but they had no idea what this fellow was up to. What was he up to again? To drink, one must seal their mystical qi. The channeling of mystical qi by skilled cultivators has long become an instinct. Even if they don't do it intentionally, it will greatly resist the dizziness of being drunk and stay sober. However, this instinct is annoying to the drinker. Too annoying. Drink? Why drink? What is the purpose of drinking? Xiao Xiaoqing was exuberant. Drinking is to get drunk, to experience the dizziness after drinking. Yes, the ethereal feeling like taking a stroll in the clouds. The contentment, the comfort, the elegance, the artistic conception. Tisk, Xiao Shaoqing closed his eyes and shook his head as if reminiscing a long-lost sentiment. Therefore, it is certain that one cannot use mystical qi when drinking. Xiao Shaoqing enthusiastically promoted his fallacious theory to the rest, but the crowd only rolled their eyes at him. No one responded to his one-sided argument, even his heir Bai Yixue ignored it. As the host, Yunyang rolled his eyes, speechless for a long time at this fellow's bizarre theory. Everyone present was a person of high status and authority. Even when they knew that there was no danger, who would dare seal their mystical qi to drink? Not to mention anything else, if everyone at this table were to seal their Xian qi while drinking, if an enemy were to suddenly appear at this time, wouldn't they be wiped out effortlessly by the enemy? If that were to happen, it would be laughable enough to explain the absurdity of it all. Bastard! Dugucho gritted his teeth in anger. He finally understood why this guy had made such a low-level mistake back then. He didn't know how long he had lost his things, but he didn't know. So this was the truth. It turned out that when this fellow drank wine, he would first seal his Xian qi. You've roamed outside for so long, yet you're still alive. You must be blessed with great fortune. Duguchao's face was as dark as the bottom of a wok. Master, you flatter me too much. Although this is the truth. Xiao Shaoqing's face drooled. This disciple's fortune and luck are all because of you, master. Scram. Before he could finish, he was kicked away by Dugucho again. Don't learn from your master. Sigh. Dugucho said. Bai Yixue, who had been keeping quiet out of fear, tried his best to shrink himself and reduce his presence, but he had not expected to be dragged out. He said with a pained expression, "This disciple obeys and will do his best." Bauer, who had not been seen for a long time, was crawling on His Majesty's knee, his face filled with reluctance. "I'm already so big, why are you still treating me like a child of 2 or 3 years old? Shouldn't an adult's knee be a place for a child to crawl on?" However, once the emperor saw Bauer, he could not move and wanted to carry him on his knee. It was something that no one could stop. Everyone sat at the same table. His Majesty looked at this and that, overwhelmed with joy. This was probably the Emperor of Yutong's long-awaited feeling of familial bliss. It was an inexplicable feeling that he had somehow obtained it. In fact, it was normal for the Emperor of Yutong to have such thoughts. The people before him were people he liked and the wine was rare. The surrounding atmosphere was comfortable, relaxed, and unrestrained. There was no formality of a ruler or official, only brotherly love and the joy of familial bliss. Amidst such an atmosphere, His Majesty's only thought was that this was perhaps the happiest meal he had ever had in his life. Even Bauer's soft body in his arms squirmed restlessly. His Majesty felt as if he was hugging the entire world in his arms. Throughout the night, the Emperor could not stop his laughter as he drank more and more. However, no one stopped him. Even Qiu Jianhan and Fang Qingtian did not try to stop him. To them, it had been too long since His Majesty could relax like this. To be able to get drunk so happily was a rare and precious enjoyment. How could they bear to interrupt him? All these years, the Empire of Yutong had been in a precarious situation. His Majesty and the few old men had been shouldering so much pressure. It was because they felt the same that they could empathize and share the same thoughts. Now the pressure had finally come to an end. It had not been easy to get through these few years. If it had been a few people with weaker mental fortitude, they would have broken down long ago and committed suicide many times over. "Bauer, my good grandson, come. Grandpa Emperor wants to test you today." The Emperor stroked his beard, his gaze affectionate as he smiled benevolently. The dignity of an empire's monarch was nowhere to be seen. He no longer had the title of emperor, all that was left was the identity of a grandfather. Everyone smiled as they watched the good show between the grandfather and the grandson. "What does Grandpa Emperor want to test Bauer on?" Bauer tilted his head. "Yes, Grandpa Emperor wants to test you. What have you learned during this period of time?" "Yes, let me think." The Emperor tapped his forehead, thinking about what question to ask. Could not be too difficult, but it could not be easy either. This was a problem. He did not know Bauer's current learning progress. After thinking for a long time, he still could not come up with a good idea. He asked gently, "Bauer, what have you been learning these days?" Bauer said, "Nothing much. A few days ago, Uncle asked me to think about a question. I've been thinking about this question for the past few days. That's all." His Majesty was obviously very interested in this topic. He said with a grin, "What question did he ask you to think about?" "Tell Grandpa Emperor." Bauer said innocently, "That day, Uncle told me the story of when the birds are gone, the good bough is hidden, and the relationship between this saying and reality. The crowd had been watching His Majesty play with his grandson with a grin on their faces, trying their best to be cooperative and interested. However, when the words were spoken, especially when paired with Bao'er's childish voice, everyone felt as if there was a sudden rumble of thunder above their heads, as if a lightning tribulation was about to befall them. For a moment, everyone's expressions were twisted. If it were not for their composure that had been trained for so many years, they would have made a fool of themselves in public. Qiu Jianhan and Fang Qingtian especially stared blankly. Chapter 772. Keep the bow when the birds are done. How could this phrase be brought up for discussion? Isn't this a little too much of a taboo? Whether it was a king or an official, they were extremely sensitive to these words. His Majesty's hand that was stroking his beard paused as well, his entire being frozen. His eyeballs almost popped out of their sockets as his hand trembled, and with a low grunt, a dozen strands of his beard were pulled out by himself. Oh ho ho ho! His Majesty chuckled dryly and turned to look at Yin Xiaoyao, chuckling as he said, I say, brother, your son's teaching method is rather unique. My heir to the throne. Does he need to understand the deeper meaning of keeping the bow when the birds are done when the birds are done when the birds are done? Yun Xiaoyao's expression had long changed as well. He was speechless as he stared at Yun Yang with eyes that looked like they were about to devour him whole, as if they were about to swallow him whole. Look at what you're teaching. There's a deeper meaning to it. If you're so capable, you can just ascend to the heavens. Can this bow when the birds are done be taught? I know you don't care about the imperial power, but you shouldn't have agreed to it in the beginning. Since you've agreed, you should have taught him well. Now that you've done this, what are you trying to do? Yun Yang was the only one in the banquet who was unperturbed. He smiled and said, Bao'er has a good memory. Not bad at all. This is it. Do you still remember what I said the other day when I taught him? What does it mean exactly? If you can repeat it clearly, Uncle will reward you. Everyone turned to look at her, and their faces were full of encouragement. They looked at Bao'er, but in reality, everyone's hearts were in their throats. The question was too sensitive. Especially now, when the entire continent was silent, with only the Empire of Yutong standing out. The situation was gradually becoming clearer. The Empire of Yutong was about to unify the world and pacify Tianxian. At this sensitive juncture, there was not enough time to reward and encourage promotions to win over the hearts of the people. Why did he want to keep the bow when the birds were done? Even if the imperial mind was a compulsory subject for royalty, this was too disgusting. There was nothing more chilling than this. She said excitedly, that day Uncle told me the story of this saying. It's about how after a hunter hunts, he hides his hunting tools. As for the deeper meaning of this saying, there are two layers to it. One is to the king. To a king, this saying is derogatory. It shows that he is despicable and useless. The other layer is to the officials. To the officials who have sacrificed everything, this saying is the greatest tragedy. At this point, everyone heaved a sigh of relief. It looked like this bastard Yin Yang still had a bottom line. His words were neither crude nor crude. His Majesty's drunken eyes flashed with a hint of sharpness. He warmly said, that is a good way to put it. Bao'er, please continue. I will listen to your uncle's words. Yun Xiaoyao clenched his teeth and glared at Yin Yang, but the latter did not take it to heart. He smiled as if he did not feel anything. Of course, Bao'er could not discern the true meaning in the emperor's words. He thought about it and said, Uncle said that this saying isn't a good thing most of the time. If it's not used in one's entire life, it's a great kindness. It's the same for others and oneself, but it's also a matter of sentiment. Then he asked me, who is the most respectable person in this world? The emperor nodded. Then who does Bao'er think is the most respectable person in this world? His Majesty hoped that Bao'er would give this title to him. It could satisfy his vanity and also give him a great sense of achievement. He could also use this as an excuse to get out of this predicament. He was already the most respectable person in this world. He could overlook the slight bias in Yin Yang's teaching. Bao'er said, I told Uncle then that the most respectable people are the heroes who give up their lives to kill the enemy on the battlefield. His Majesty sighed inwardly, but he felt a surge of warmth in his heart. Oh? Bao'er said, that's what Bao'er said. Uncle said that Bao'er was right. The most respectable people are these heroes. Without their sacrifice, how can there be peace in this world? However, if there's a day in the future when the world is truly at peace and these heroes have no war to fight, will they still be the most respectable people? His Majesty's hawk-like gaze sliced at Yin Yang and said, this is a problem. What does Bao think? Bao said, Bao thinks that these people are still the most respectable people. They've already fought the war they need to fight, so of course they're respectable. Besides, because of their existence, we're even less afraid of war. His Majesty smiled happily and said, Bao is right. And then? Uncle said that I'm right too. He then told me that heroes should always be treated like heroes. He told me to always think about the saying, the good Bao is set aside when the birds are gone, and not to forget my original intention. Bao said. Black lines appeared on everyone's foreheads and they all started coughing. If *CK they had finally gotten around it, why were they back at it now? This was simply, Fang Qingtian and Qiu Jianhan felt like there were nails in their buttocks. They could hardly conceal their uneasiness. The issue was already grave when they discussed it in private, but it was even more thrilling when they discussed it in front of the emperor. Bao'er's childish voice spoke methodically, now the empire of Yutong is about to unify the world. Once it's unified, we'll have to face the problem of setting aside the good Bao when the birds are gone. What he said was exactly what Qiu Jianhan and Fang Qingtian were feeling. Yes, if the world were to be unified, then the ones who would be in the most awkward position would undoubtedly be these soldiers who had given up everything and even their lives. How should they be resettled? How could they not forget their original intention? Soldiers, especially outstanding ones, were the proudest and most valiant of all. If they were to be rewarded based on their contributions, each of them would have a considerable amount of merit. However, such people would hardly have a place to use their skills after occupying a high position. How could they be resettled after that? How could they last for long? If they could not be resettled, what would happen if they did not last for long? This was an extremely serious problem. The more profound thought was almost obvious and no one could overlook it. However, a considerable portion of these people were destined to become unstable factors. There was no doubt about this. There was no benefit in avoiding it. The emperor's gaze was still sharp as he said, Bao continue? Bao said, Uncle said, the good Bao is set aside when the birds are gone. It's a very good saying. Since it's a good Bao, it should be kept well. When the time comes to use it, it doesn't have to be cooked after the cunning hare is dead. Chapter 773. The birds are gone, but it's only temporary. Since they're birds, they're destined to fly here and there. It's an inextinguishable nature. As for hiding a good Bao, it's more about a good Bao. A good Bao is a good Bao. Of course, we have to hide and maintain a good Bao so that it doesn't lose its combat power. It's not that we don't want to use it, but it's so that we can kill the birds better the next time. Bao said, Uncle said that this must be done, but it's also a matter of method. For example, if we hide a good Bao, what if we don't take good care of it and it goes moldy? Therefore, at the same time, how could he keep the Bao in its best condition? This is what we need to do the most. After he finished speaking, everyone present fell silent. His Majesty stroked his beard, deep in thought. His gaze flickered, but the hidden anger and sharpness on his face had vanished completely. Qiu Jianhan and Fang Qingtian were also deep in thought. This was a problem that needed to be considered carefully. If a soldier slacked off after the war, it would be difficult for him to regain his reputation as a good Bao. This would be detrimental to the country and the soldiers themselves. At this moment, Yun Yang had used the young child's mouth to raise the inevitable sharp question and pointed out a direction that everyone could accept. It was painstaking, meaningful, and tempting. The problem now was the specific grasp of this established direction. There was no longer the atmosphere that could have been at daggers drawn like before. Yun Yang sat on the side, maintaining a nonchalant smile. He toasted Ling Xiaozue, clinked glasses with Du Guchou, drank with Xiao Xiaoqing, and winked at Ji Lingxi and Shengguan Lingxiu, trying to act cool. His Majesty pondered for a moment and said, Bao, did your Uncle Yun say how to hide the good Bao when the birds are gone? What should I do exactly? Yun Yang was sitting here, but the emperor did not ask him but Bao. The meaning behind his question was clear. Bao blinked and said in a wrong tone, Uncle asked Bao to think about the follow-up question myself, but he didn't give an answer. He said that this was homework. Bao had to use this question to write 3 large sheets of paper, and he had to be satisfied before it was over. The emperor laughed heartily. Have you finished writing? Bao lowered her head and said in shame, I haven't finished writing yet. The emperor asked, then how do you plan to write it? Bao's childish face showed a thoughtful expression. He said, based on what Uncle said, this Bao, no matter how you take care of it and hide it, with the passage of time, it will inevitably rust and rot. Only by using it often can it be as good as new. Based on this premise, Bao Er thought and thought, thinking about how to hide it and use it without hiding it. The emperor's entire body trembled and he murmured, "Since it's hidden, can it be used without hiding?" Bao Er said innocently. Bao Er thought about it for a long time and still couldn't figure it out. The original intention of hiding it is to not use it, and not using it now is still not using it. Using it without hiding it is already a contradiction. Then Bao Er thought, why don't I just not hide it? A bow isn't only used to shoot birds. Since it's a bow and arrow, other than shooting birds in the sky, it can also shoot tigers, wolves, foxes, rabbits. If it doesn't work, it can also shoot mice, longworms, and so on. The emperor's eyes glinted as he murmured, it can also shoot tigers, wolves, mice. For a moment he was lost in thought, speechless. Qiu Jianhan and Fang Qingtian looked at each other and smiled. Suddenly they felt a great sense of relief. Bao Er's words had vaguely hinted at two different solutions. To Bao Er, keeping it and using it without hiding it were polar opposites that could not coexist. However, to the courtiers and politicians, there was a huge room for maneuver. As for shooting tigers, wolves, and all the animals in the world, there was an unimaginable trend of extension. His words hit the nail on the head and the meaning was profound. The two important figures could not help chortling in unison. "Congratulations, Your Majesty. Congratulations, Your Majesty." His Majesty shook his head, the smile on his face growing. Suddenly he guffawed, "Ha!" The three of them raised their goblets at the same time. His Majesty's voice was very loud. "I'm really very happy today. I must get drunk with my two old brothers. We won't go home until we're drunk." Qiu Jianhan and Fang Qingtian said happily, "This official would like to get drunk today as well. We will definitely accompany Your Majesty with our lives and won't go home until we're drunk." The three of them downed their goblets. Then they began to raise their goblets at a high frequency, their spirits soaring. They were indescribably excited and high-spirited. The emperor raised his goblet and suddenly said, "Bao Er, how much of what we've said just now do you really understand?" Bao Er blinked and said, "Uncle said that it's fine as long as the hero's heart isn't broken." The emperor let out a long laugh that could shatter the roof tiles. "Ah, good good good." After saying good 3 times, he suddenly raised his goblet and said loudly, "What a great young master Yun Yang. I would like to propose a toast to you today." Yun Xiaoyao was relieved and said with a smile, "This bastard only knows how to talk. He's not worthy of your toast. Brother, please don't spoil him." The emperor shook his head. "No no no. I propose this goblet of wine willingly and willingly." Yun Yang laughed and raised his goblet. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I shall drink as much as Your Majesty drinks today." The emperor was even more delighted when he heard that. Without another word, he downed his goblet in one gulp. Towards the end of the drinking session, not only was His Majesty drunk, Qiu Jianhan and Fang Qingtian were also tipsy. However, the laughter never stopped and the atmosphere was extremely joyous. Even when he helped the emperor onto the dragon carriage for his return, he was still shouting, "Bring the wine, I'm happy today. I won't stop until I'm drunk, I won't return until I'm drunk." It looked like he was really drunk and needed to return. Residents of Yun. Yun Yang looked at the little fellow with a dark expression. "Who taught you to say these words?" Bao Er looked up and said, "Other than the hero not being broken, Uncle should not be. Uncle must always be happy, that is what makes Bao Er the happiest." Yun Yang looked at Bao Er in silence and said softly, "Don't show off your intelligence too much. That's what makes a good child." Obviously, Bao Er's precociousness had far exceeded Yun Yang's expectations. Yun Yang could already foresee that if Bao Er remained like this, perhaps he would have to hand over his title of supreme wit to him in the future. Bao Er nodded vigorously. "Bao Er remembers every word Uncle says seriously. I dare not forget it." He raised his head and said softly, "But Uncle will leave Bao Er sooner or later, won't he?" He lowered his head and said, "Bao Er can't bear to leave Uncle." Yun Yang was silent for a moment and patted Bao Er's head. He wanted to say something but did not say anything in the end. These days Yun Yang had been keeping Liang Qiu and the others under strict control. Whoever came into contact with Bao Er and what they said were under his surveillance at every moment. It could be said that there were no blind spots. There was indeed no one to teach him. Then, did Bao Er think of these words himself? Thinking of Bao Er's young face, Yun Yang's gaze froze. There was joy and sorrow. How many people say that I explain too much, so I leave it to everyone to understand? You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.